Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into a marriage market where the groom is rich, musical, athletic, charming, intelligent, magnificently dressed, and eventually quite capable of changing the religion of an entire country because his personal life has become inconvenient. We're talking about Henry VIII, and more specifically, what it was actually like to marry him. Not the rhyme, not the portraits, not 6 women standing patiently in a school textbook beneath the words divorced, beheaded, died, while Henry occupies the middle looking like a decorative wardrobe with trust issues. We're talking about the lived reality of becoming Queen of England, beside a man whose idea of marital difficulty could involve ambassadors, canon lawyers, parliament, several bishops, the Pope, and eventually an executioner. Because marrying Henry was not simply getting a husband. You were marrying a dynasty that had existed for barely a generation. You were marrying the expectation of sons. You were marrying the Tudor court, where several hundred people could have an informed opinion about your womb before breakfast. You were marrying international diplomacy, religious politics, household management, public ceremony, private disappointment, and a man who in his youth could be generous, affectionate, clever, athletic, and genuinely captivating. Which, inconveniently, made the whole thing much more complicated. But first, a huge genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and you have somehow looked at 6 spectacularly difficult royal marriages and thought, yes, that sounds relaxing. I respect the confidence. Comments like yours genuinely shape what we make here, so thank you. And if you're enjoying the channel, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There is something wonderfully comforting about discovering that while one person is listening from Manchester at 11:30, someone else is lying awake in Australia at 3 a.m, learning far too much about Tudor reproductive politics. Also, we're on Spotify, so if you'd rather listen there, you'll find the link in the description. Now, dim the lights. Put a fan on if you've got one. Pull the blanket up, adjust the pillow, move the phone somewhere your hand cannot automatically find it every 4 minutes. Get truly, properly comfortable, because your evening is about to become significantly worse by comparison. Before we begin, let's sit with a few questions. What happens when the most powerful man in England decides he wants to marry you? Can you say no? More importantly, can you say no twice? How much privacy does a queen actually have when servants dress her, ladies accompany her, physicians discuss her fertility, diplomats report on her appearance, and foreign governments receive updates about her menstrual cycle with the seriousness normally reserved for military movements? What does your wedding night look like when the future of the Tudor dynasty is effectively waiting outside the bedroom door? What happens if you give Henry a daughter? What happens if you become pregnant, lose the child, become pregnant again, and slowly realize that an intensely personal grief is being converted into a political problem by men wearing velvet? What happens when your husband falls in love with someone else? Can a king simply decide that 20 years of marriage were a theological misunderstanding? Can he make Parliament agree? Can he make the Church agree? Can he make you agree? And if you do agree, does that make you sensible or merely alive? What happens when Henry has been married 4 times already and then asks for your hand with the relaxed confidence of a man whose relationship history is now a matter of European diplomacy? What does it feel like when the handsome prince you married becomes the enormous, injured, suspicious older king from the portraits? How carefully do you choose your words when disagreeing over religion with a husband who has previously demonstrated a fairly decisive approach to disagreement? And perhaps most importantly, if Henry VIII decided tomorrow morning that you were exactly what England needed in a queen, how long would it take before you began looking for the nearest quiet convent? Congratulations. You've just woken up in England. The year is 1536. Henry VIII is 44 years old. He has been king for nearly 27 years. Catherine of Aragon is dead. Anne Boleyn is still Queen of England as we begin, although the atmosphere around her has developed the unmistakable quality of a meeting where everyone except you has already seen the agenda. Jane Seymour is nearby. Court factions are moving. Lawyers are becoming unusually busy. And through some catastrophic failure of family judgment, you are considered excellent queen material. Welcome to the Tudor court. Try not to become a precedent. 1. Your marriage begins as an international business arrangement. Let's start before Henry has even spoken to you. Because if you are being considered as a wife for the King of England, there is an excellent chance that several elderly men have already discussed your reproductive prospects in a room you have never entered. Royal marriage in Tudor Europe is not primarily a romantic arrangement. It is diplomacy with bedding. You are a daughter, certainly, perhaps even a beloved one, but you are also an alliance, a dowry, a possible peace treaty, a connection to foreign armies, and, everyone hopes, the future mother of several healthy sons. Somewhere, an ambassador is writing a letter about your complexion with the confidence of a man reviewing livestock he has seen briefly across a crowded hall. If you are a foreign princess, the negotiations can begin years before you are old enough to understand what marriage is. Catherine of Aragon was promised to Henry's elder brother Arthur while both were still young. Her marriage was intended to strengthen the alliance between England and Spain, joining the relatively new Tudor dynasty to the prestigious ruling house of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. This was excellent diplomacy. Whether Catherine and Arthur enjoyed one another's company was almost a secondary administrative detail. Then Arthur died, and instead of everyone quietly accepting that the plan had failed, diplomacy simply looked at Henry. Henry was now the surviving Tudor son. Catherine was still a Spanish princess. There was money involved, political advantage involved, and two royal families who had already invested heavily in the arrangement. The obvious Tudor solution was therefore to consider marrying Catherine to her dead husband's younger brother. You can see how romance is thriving. Years of negotiation followed. There were disputes over Catherine's dowry, arguments between Henry VII and Ferdinand, questions about whether the marriage would actually happen, and the important theological problem of Catherine having previously been married to Arthur. A papal dispensation was obtained so that she could marry Henry. Catherine maintained that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a claim that would become rather more important approximately 20 years later when Henry suddenly developed an intense interest in biblical marriage law. At the beginning, however, the arrangement worked remarkably well. Henry became king in 1509 and married Catherine soon afterward. He was 17, approaching 18. She was 23. They were young, handsome, wealthy, magnificently dressed, and standing at the centre of a kingdom eager for the new Tudor reign to begin. Henry appears to have genuinely cared for her. Catherine was intelligent, politically experienced, deeply religious, and perfectly trained for queenship. For a while, the international business arrangement produced something recognisably close to a successful marriage. But that does not change what brought you into the room. If you are a royal bride, people want to know what your family can provide. Territory matters, money matters, military support matters, your religion matters, your bloodline matters enormously. Your appearance matters because Henry would prefer to find you attractive, but even beauty is partly political. A healthy-looking princess suggests healthy children, and healthy children mean succession. Anne of Cleves would encounter this machinery decades later, when Henry needed a fourth wife. Thomas Cromwell encouraged a German alliance, Hans Holbein was sent to paint Anne and her sister, and negotiations proceeded around religion and European politics before Henry had even met the woman he might marry. Imagine discovering that someone has effectively swiped right on a diplomatic portrait, and this is the uncomfortable truth waiting beneath all the velvet. You may become Queen of England, wear jewels worth fortunes, command an enormous household, and sit beside one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. But before any of that happens, you are being evaluated as part of a larger calculation. Nobody has asked whether you like his laugh yet. Europe is still checking the dowry. 2. Saying no to the king is technically possible. Now, let's talk about the proposal. Because when Henry VIII decides he would like to marry you, this is not quite the same as someone nervously asking whether you are free on Saturday. There is no easy little pause in which you can smile politely, explain that you are concentrating on yourself at the moment, and hope everyone remains friends. Henry is the King of England. His wishes move through the court with weight. The moment his interest becomes obvious, people around you begin adjusting their own ambitions accordingly, and suddenly your private romantic future has acquired advisors. This matters because Henry does not always choose women who were originally expecting to become queens. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of an ambitious court family, well-connected and highly educated, but she had not been raised as a foreign princess destined to marry a king. Jane Seymour came from the English gentry. Catherine Howard was a young noblewoman serving at court. Catherine Parr was already twice widowed and appears to have hoped to marry Thomas Seymour before Henry entered the picture. Then Henry noticed her. At that point, personal preference becomes rather less important. Catherine Parr later described her marriage to Henry in religious terms, presenting it as something she believed God had called her to undertake. That may well reflect genuine faith. It also provides a wonderfully diplomatic way of explaining why you have married a man roughly 3 decades older than you who has already worked his way through 5 wives with results ranging from annulment to execution. You do not write, "I was extremely aware of the statistics." You write about divine purpose. The difficulty is that Henry's proposal is never just coming from Henry. Behind him stands the monarchy. Accepting him makes you queen. It raises your family. Brothers, uncles, and cousins may suddenly find themselves receiving offices, influence, and access. Your household changes. Your social position becomes almost unimaginably elevated. Your relatives therefore have an understandable tendency to become enthusiastic about the relationship. This means that if you hesitate, you are not simply disappointing an admirer. You may be frustrating your entire family's greatest political opportunity. Try explaining over dinner that you have decided not to become Queen of England because you do not think the chemistry is right. Your father may require a moment, and then there is the king himself. Henry was accustomed to obedience. Court life trained everyone around him to anticipate his wishes, praise his decisions, and make inconvenient obstacles disappear before he had to look at them for too long. In his younger years, this existed alongside charm, generosity, and genuine romantic performance. He wrote affectionate letters to Anne Boleyn during his long pursuit of her. He sent gifts. He adopted the language of courtly love. He could make his attention feel extraordinarily flattering. But royal attention is difficult to separate from royal power. Anne Boleyn famously resisted becoming Henry's mistress for years while he was still married to Catherine of Aragon. Whatever mixture of personal conviction, ambition, attraction, and strategy shaped her choices, refusing the role of mistress did not make Henry lose interest. Quite the opposite. His determination intensified until the relationship became connected to the question of whether his first marriage could be ended. This is the peculiar danger of saying no to an absolute monarch. Sometimes he accepts it. Sometimes he interprets it as the beginning of negotiations. Even after marriage, consent remains tangled with power. Anne of Cleves provides perhaps the clearest example of what cooperation could achieve. When Henry decided he wanted their marriage annulled, Anne did not mount the kind of resistance Catherine of Aragon had offered. She accepted the settlement. In return, she received estates, income, status, and a remarkably comfortable position at court. She survived Henry by understanding when not to fight him. So yes, technically you can say no to Henry VIII. There is no law requiring every woman he notices to marry him. But when the man asking controls titles, property, patronage, access to court, and a large portion of your family's future, freedom of choice becomes a rather delicate concept. You may still have a decision. It just happens to be surrounded by several hundred people hoping you make the correct one. 3. First, you have to survive being inspected. Before marriage comes evaluation, because if you are being considered as a wife for Henry VIII, apparently it is not enough to be noble, educated, politically useful, and technically available. The king would also quite like to know what you look like. This sounds reasonable until you remember that royal courtship in the 16th century may involve ambassadors, relatives, painters, and government officials describing you to one another with the detached confidence of people inspecting a horse they are considering buying. If you are already at the English court, Henry can conduct much of this assessment himself. He can watch you dance, hear you speak, notice how you behave around other people, and decide whether your particular arrangement of face and personality appeals to him. Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Catherine Howard all came into Henry's orbit through court life, which meant the king encountered them in person before marriage became a formal question. For a foreign princess, things are considerably less convenient. You may be several hundred miles away, separated from Henry by sea, language, and the general inconvenience of 16th century transport. Someone therefore has to investigate on his behalf. Ambassadors become part diplomat, part marriage broker, and part extremely nervous reviewer. They may comment on your height, colouring, manners, health, and general attractiveness. They may ask whether you have suffered serious illness. They may observe how you carry yourself. Your family connections are already known. What Henry wants now is reassurance that the woman attached to the alliance is personally acceptable. There is one obvious problem. Nobody possesses a camera. Portraits, therefore, become enormously important. When Henry began considering Anne of Cleves and her sister Amalia as possible brides, the artist Hans Holbein the Younger was sent to produce likenesses. Holbein was one of the finest portrait painters in Europe, which is reassuring until you remember that his painting might now influence whether you are shipped across the continent to marry a man you have never met. No pressure. The portrait must be flattering enough to represent you well, but accurate enough that the king does not arrive at the wedding claiming he has been deceived. This is an unusually narrow artistic brief. Henry chose Anne. Political considerations mattered enormously. An alliance with Cleves offered useful connections among German Protestant powers at a moment when England's position in Europe looked uncertain. But Henry also needed to find his prospective wife attractive enough to make the marriage function. Then Anne arrived in England. Henry decided to surprise her at Rochester in January of 1540. Courtly tradition allowed a disguised lover to approach his lady and be recognised through some almost mystical bond of romance. Henry clearly enjoyed this kind of theatrical idea. Unfortunately, Anne had never met him, so when an unfamiliar older gentleman suddenly entered and embraced or kissed her in accordance with the game, she did not react with the enchanted recognition Henry apparently expected. This did not help. Henry left deeply disappointed. Soon he was complaining about Anne's appearance and insisting that the reality had failed to match his expectations. Exactly how much of his later criticism was genuine first impression, and how much became convenient justification for a marriage he quickly wanted to escape, remains debated. But for you, the lesson is unpleasantly simple. You are not merely being judged as a diplomatic partner. You are being judged as a woman. Henry may inspect your appearance, your manners, your health, and your ability to produce the emotional response he expects from you. And because he is king, his personal preference can quickly become everyone else's political emergency. Thomas Cromwell had helped arrange the Cleves marriage. When the marriage collapsed, his position collapsed with it. He was executed later that same year. So if you are waiting nervously for Henry to decide whether he likes your portrait, remember that you are not the only person sweating. Somewhere nearby, a government minister's neck may also depend on your cheekbones. 4. The wedding may be strangely small for a king. It's your wedding day. And considering you are about to marry Henry VIII, ruler of England, owner of palaces, employer of musicians, collector of tapestries, enthusiast for gold, velvet, jewels, and making absolutely everything look more expensive than it needs to be, you might reasonably expect an enormous public spectacle. Trumpets, processions, hundreds of guests, perhaps 3 bishops competing to stand nearest the altar. Instead, depending on which wife you happen to be, the ceremony may be surprisingly quiet. Henry's marriages were not all celebrated with the same degree of public magnificence. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1509 took place shortly after he became king, before their joint coronation at Westminster Abbey later that month. Other marriages happened much more discreetly, sometimes because the circumstances surrounding them were politically awkward enough without inviting half of London to watch. Anne Boleyn's wedding is the obvious example. By the beginning of 1533, Anne was pregnant and Henry needed the marriage completed. There was one small administrative problem. Most of Europe still regarded him as married to Catherine of Aragon, so Henry and Anne married secretly. The precise details remain uncertain, but the ceremony appears to have taken place in late January, probably at Whitehall Palace, with a small number of people present. There was no grand public announcement beforehand, no enormous procession through London, no cheerful printed invitation explaining that the king was marrying his long-term romantic interest, while the legal status of his first wife remained the subject of an international religious crisis. Some events benefit from a smaller guest list. Anne's public magnificence came later. Her coronation in June was spectacular, with processions, pageants, and elaborate decoration intended to present her queenship as legitimate, glorious, and permanent. History, which has a rather cruel sense of pacing, allowed that permanence approximately 3 years. Jane Seymour's wedding was also comparatively restrained. She married Henry at Whitehall Palace in May of 1536, only 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution. Even by Tudor standards, this is not much time to reorganise the seating plan. There were political advantages in proceeding quickly. Henry wanted a new marriage, a legitimate heir, and a clean public transition away from Anne. Jane became queen, but she was never crowned. Her marriage was recognised, her status was unmistakable, and eventually she gave Henry the son he had wanted for so long. The ceremony itself did not need to carry all the weight. By the time you reach Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, the wedding has become almost domestic by royal standards. Henry married her at Hampton Court in July of 1543 in the Queen's Closet, with a relatively small group of witnesses. This does not mean the occasion is casual. Nothing involving Henry's court is truly casual. You still dress magnificently. Your clothing communicates rank before anyone hears your name. Fine fabrics, embroidery, and jewellery turn your body into a public declaration that something important is happening. Clergy conduct the service. Witnesses stand nearby. Formal words are spoken. The marriage is entered into a world where ceremony matters deeply, because ceremony makes hierarchy visible, but the room may still be smaller than you imagined. And then comes the strange emotional reality of it. You stand beside Henry and speak vows that are intensely personal, while almost everyone present is also thinking about politics. Your family sees advancement. Courtiers see opportunity. Ambassadors see alliances. Henry sees a wife. The council sees succession. And you, somewhere inside several layers of expensive fabric, are expected to experience all of this as the beginning of married life. There is also the uncomfortable knowledge that royal marriage does not end when the ceremony does. The wedding simply changes your title. Becoming queen begins immediately afterward. Your household must be established. Servants and ladies must be appointed. Apartments must be prepared. Gifts are exchanged. Clothing, plate and jewels announce your new status. People who previously bowed to you now bow slightly differently, which is apparently how constitutional change worked before PowerPoint, and the public will eventually need to see you. A Tudor queen is not merely Henry's private companion. She is part of the monarchy's public image. Her marriage carries expectations about fertility, stability, religion, and dynasty. However quiet the wedding itself may be, the consequences are enormous. So enjoy the ceremony while it lasts. Stand beside your new husband. Listen to the prayers. Feel the weight of the gown. Notice the candles, the polished wood, the murmured voices, and the eyes of the handful of people trusted enough to witness the moment. It is surprisingly intimate, which is lovely, because from tomorrow onward, almost nothing about your marriage will be private again. 5. Becoming queen means losing the last of your privacy. Now you're married, which means you have acquired a crown, an enormous household, access to some of the finest rooms in England, and approximately 12 minutes of genuine privacy for the remainder of your natural life. Becoming Henry VIII's queen does not simply mean moving into a nicer bedroom. It means becoming the centre of an entire domestic institution. Wherever you go, people come with you. Ladies attend you. Servants wait outside doors. Clerks manage expenses. Chaplains oversee worship. Gentlewomen help with clothing. Pages carry messages. Guards control access. Somewhere nearby, someone is always carrying a basin. Your private apartments are certainly more restricted than the public rooms of the palace. Not everyone can simply wander into the Queen's chamber and ask how your morning is going. Access itself reflects rank. The closer someone is permitted to come to you physically, the more important or trusted they generally are. But restricted access is not the same as solitude. You wake surrounded by people whose job is to know that you have woken. A servant brings water. Your ladies arrive. Clothing is laid out. Hair must be arranged. Jewellery selected. Messages presented. Perhaps Henry has sent something. Perhaps an ambassador is waiting. Perhaps there is mass to attend, a petition to consider, a visitor to receive, or some piece of household business requiring your approval. You have not yet finished dressing, and the working day has already located you. Even bodily functions that you would consider intensely private exist within this larger household system. A queen's health matters because her health is connected to fertility, and fertility is connected to succession. If your appetite changes, someone notices. If you appear pale, someone notices. If you remain in bed, someone notices. If your menstrual cycle is late, several people may become interested very quickly. Nothing says marital intimacy quite like foreign diplomats discussing whether you might be pregnant. Ambassadors regularly reported rumours about royal pregnancies because the birth of a child could alter European politics. A son might secure the Tudor succession. A daughter might become valuable in a future marriage alliance. Your body therefore produces information that people hundreds of miles away would very much like to obtain, and the servants are usually the first people positioned to obtain it. This does not mean every lady in your chamber is secretly writing to the emperor before lunch. Many are genuinely loyal companions. Some may become your closest friends. They help you through illness, pregnancy, grief, and the exhausting ceremonial demands of queenship. But everyone at court belongs to networks. Your ladies have fathers, brothers, husbands, cousins, and patrons. Their families have political interests. Conversations travel. A remark made while your hair is being dressed can reach another household by evening and an ambassador's report shortly afterward. The court runs largely on information, and your apartments contain some of the most valuable information available. Then there is Henry. Even your time with your husband exists inside layers of ceremony. There are private moments, certainly, but reaching them requires passing through rooms full of attendants. His household surrounds him just as yours surrounds you. Servants know when he visits your chambers. They know how long he stays. They know whether he sends gifts afterward. They may not know exactly what happened behind the closed door. They know enough. This becomes particularly important when royal affection changes. If Henry begins visiting less often, people notice before anyone formally announces that something is wrong. If another woman starts receiving unusual attention, the court notices that too. Royal marriages can begin to fail publicly long before husband and wife admit it privately, and so you learn to perform composure. You smile while people watch. You dress carefully. You attend chapel. You receive visitors. You behave as though your marriage is perfectly secure because queenship itself depends partly on looking secure. You are one of the highest-ranking women in Europe. You have servants waiting on every need. You occupy magnificent chambers filled with tapestries, cushions, carved furniture, and expensive cloth. And occasionally, you would probably give all of it for the ability to close a door and know nobody on the other side is listening. 6. Your ladies are friends, staff, witnesses, and intelligence network. Let's talk about the women surrounding you, because once you become Henry VIII's queen, you are rarely alone, and the people closest to you are not guards or ministers. They are women. Ladies in waiting, gentlewomen, maids of honour, chamber attendants and trusted servants move through your rooms from morning until night, helping you dress, carrying messages, attending prayers, accompanying you through the palace, and quietly observing almost everything that happens around you. Some will become genuine friends, some will be loyal to their families first. A few may be doing both at the same time, which is where court life becomes interesting. Your household is not assembled randomly. Places near the Queen are valuable. Noble families want their daughters there because proximity to you means proximity to power. A young woman serving in your chambers can meet influential courtiers, improve her family's position, attract a wealthy husband, and hear information unavailable almost anywhere else. This makes your rooms one of the most socially valuable workplaces in England. It also means your father, brother, uncle, husband, or cousin may be extremely interested in what you heard before breakfast. You learn quickly that conversation has weight. Suppose Henry seems irritated during dinner. Your ladies notice. Suppose he sends you an expensive jewel the following morning. They notice that too. Suppose he stops visiting your chambers for several nights and begins dancing rather enthusiastically with another woman. Nobody needs an official announcement. The palace has already updated itself. This is particularly uncomfortable because Henry has a habit of noticing women who serve queens. Anne Boleyn spent time in Catherine of Aragon's household before becoming the woman Henry pursued while attempting to end his marriage to Catherine. Jane Seymour later served Anne Boleyn before attracting Henry's interest herself. Catherine Howard served Anne of Cleves before becoming Henry's 5th wife. If you are beginning to see a pattern, congratulations, so did everyone else. There is something almost absurd about being queen while knowing that the group of elegant young women helping arrange your sleeves also contains exactly the demographic your husband historically finds interesting. You cannot simply dismiss anyone attractive. That would remove most of the Tudor court by Thursday, and your ladies are genuinely necessary. A queen's clothing alone requires help. Heavy gowns, fitted bodices, detachable sleeves, jewellery, headwear, and layers of linen are not designed around the principle of independent morning efficiency. Your attendants lace, pin, fasten, and arrange you. They manage clothing, prepare rooms, accompany you to chapel, and remain nearby during meals and entertainments. During pregnancy, they become even more important. When you enter confinement before childbirth, male access to your chambers is sharply restricted, and women take over almost entirely. Your ladies remain beside you through the waiting, discomfort, fear, and eventual labour. These are not simply decorative courtiers standing elegantly near tapestries. They perform intimate and emotionally difficult work, which is why betrayal among them can be devastating. Anne Boleyn's downfall in 1536 involved testimony and accusations gathered from the world immediately surrounding the Queen. Catherine Howard's destruction several years later depended heavily on information provided by people who knew about her past and her private meetings. Once an investigation begins, servants can become witnesses, conversations become evidence, and the woman who carried your message yesterday may be explaining that message to the King's Council tomorrow. Even innocent details become dangerous when powerful men start asking questions. Who entered the chamber? How long did he stay? Was the door closed? Who delivered the letter? Did the Queen seem frightened? Did she say anything afterward? Suddenly your household resembles an intelligence service where everyone is wearing velvet. Yet, it would be wrong to imagine your ladies as constantly scheming spies. Many relationships between queens and their attendants were affectionate and durable. These women shared long days, religious observance, music, sewing, gossip, travel, illness, pregnancy, and grief. When political life became frightening, trusted female companionship could offer one of the few genuinely comforting spaces available to you. The difficulty is that friendship at court never exists entirely outside politics. Your closest companion may love you sincerely. Her brother may still want a promotion, so you learn another essential skill of Tudor queenship. You speak warmly, you trust carefully, and before saying anything truly dangerous, you have a very good look around the room. 7. Dressing for breakfast requires a small administrative team. It's morning, and before you can think about food, diplomacy, pregnancy, religion, or whether your husband appears unusually interested in one of your attendants, you need to get dressed. This is not a matter of reaching for yesterday's clothes from the chair. You are Queen of England. Your body is now part of the visual machinery of monarchy, and presenting it correctly requires fabric, jewellery, pins, laces, starch, several pairs of experienced hands, and enough preparation to make getting ready for work in the modern world look like a remarkably efficient system. The process begins with linen. Against your skin you wear a clean smock or shift, usually made from linen, because this is the layer designed to absorb sweat and body oils. Tudor people do wash themselves, despite what later stereotypes might suggest, but full bathing is inconvenient and irregular compared with modern standards. Clean linen therefore does a great deal of practical work. Your shift can be changed and laundered much more easily than the magnificent outer gown that may contain velvet, silk, embroidery, fur, metal thread, and enough financial investment to make putting it anywhere near a wash tub an act of economic sabotage. Over the linen come the garments that create the correct shape. Depending on the point in Henry's reign, the precise silhouette changes, because even Tudor queens are not spared the misery of fashion moving while they are still paying for the previous version. Structured undergarments support the torso. Petticoats add warmth and shape. A farthingale, introduced into England through Spanish influence and particularly associated with Catherine of Aragon's generation, can help hold skirts away from the legs in a more deliberate outline. Then comes the gown itself. This is where your attendants become essential. Heavy fabric has to be positioned correctly. Sleeves may be separate pieces attached to the gown. Fastenings need attention. Pins are everywhere because Tudor clothing has an almost touching faith in the ability of small pieces of metal to keep an aristocracy together. And your clothing is not simply decorative. It tells everyone who you are. Rich fabrics, expensive dyes, fur, gold embroidery, and jewels all communicate status. Sumptuary laws regulate who is entitled to wear certain materials and colours, because Tudor government has looked at the possibility of people dressing however they please and decided this would obviously lead to social collapse. As Queen, fortunately, you are sitting at the top of this particular pyramid. You may wear magnificence that ordinary people could never legally or financially approach. Pearls appear on clothing and headwear. Gold chains and jewelled pendants catch the light. Sleeves display costly fabric because apparently the wrist is an excellent place to demonstrate international purchasing power. Your head requires its own negotiations. Catherine of Aragon helped popularise the distinctive English gable hood, with its angular shape framing the face. Anne Boleyn is famously associated with the softer French hood, which reveals more of the hair at the front. Fashion at court shifts with influence, and when the queen changes, the clothes around her may gradually change too. This means that even your hat can become political. Imagine discovering that the woman replacing you has also replaced everyone's preferred headwear. There are easier divorces. Your ladies arrange the hood, smooth the fabric, pin everything into place, and make certain no important portion of royal clothing has decided to migrate sideways overnight. Hair is dressed beneath it. Jewellery is chosen according to the occasion. If you are appearing publicly, every visible detail matters because people will look. They always look. Ambassadors may describe your appearance in letters. Courtiers notice whether you seem healthy. Rivals notice whether you are wearing a particular jewel Henry gave you. If you suddenly appear in unusually rich clothing, someone may decide the marriage is flourishing. If you appear subdued, someone else may begin wondering whether the king is displeased. You have not said anything. Your sleeves have apparently issued a diplomatic statement. Eventually, after perhaps an hour or more of being laced, pinned, layered, adjusted, and inspected, you are ready to leave your chamber. You look magnificent. You are warm beneath several layers of cloth. Your posture is excellent because your clothing has given you very limited alternatives, and somewhere beyond the door, breakfast is waiting. Fortunately, getting dressed was the easy part. 8. Hampton Court. Is a palace and a human traffic problem? Let's step outside your chamber because the palace itself is part of the marriage. If you are imagining Hampton Court as a peaceful royal home with a few grand rooms, some gardens, and Henry occasionally wandering past carrying a lute, you need to increase the population considerably. By the height of Henry's reign, the palace could accommodate an enormous royal household and court. When the king was in residence, servants, nobles, clerks, guards, cooks, musicians, messengers, petitioners, craftsmen, priests, officials, and assorted people hoping to become important, all move through the same network of courtyards, galleries, staircases, chambers, kitchens, and guarded doorways. It is less a house than a temporary city with exceptionally good tapestries. And you, as queen, are living close to the centre of it. Hampton Court had originally been developed magnificently by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's powerful minister, before Wolsey's spectacular fall from favour encouraged the palace to become Henry's instead. Henry expanded it further, creating a royal residence designed not only for comfort, but for display. Red brick walls, tall chimneys, decorated gateways, vast halls, private apartments, chapels, gardens, and enormous kitchens all communicate exactly the message Henry likes communicating. The king is here. The king is rich. Please notice both. But all this splendour requires labour on an extraordinary scale. Walk toward the kitchens and the atmosphere changes immediately. Fires burn for hours, meat turns on spits, pots steam, bakers work, scullions scrub. Servants carry baskets, barrels and dishes through passages, while cooks coordinate meals for hundreds of people. The heat is intense, the floors are busy, and the smell is a mixture of roasting meat, smoke, bread, ale, grease, and human effort. Your dinner does not simply appear. An entire industrial operation has spent the afternoon arranging it. Move back toward the royal apartments and the traffic becomes more controlled. Tudor palaces are structured around access. The farther inward you travel toward Henry's private rooms, the fewer people are allowed to follow. Public or semi-public spaces accommodate large numbers of courtiers. Beyond them lie increasingly restricted chambers where proximity to the king becomes a visible measure of political importance. If you are permitted through one door and another man is not, everyone notices. The architecture itself is ranking you. Henry's privy chamber becomes especially important because the gentlemen allowed close personal access to him can wield enormous influence. They see the king when he is less formal. They can speak to him at moments when others cannot. They can carry petitions, recommend appointments, pass information, and quietly shape what reaches royal attention. This means the corridors outside Henry's rooms are full of people attempting to become useful to people who are useful to people who can reach Henry. LinkedIn has not yet been invented. The system is already functioning perfectly well without it. As queen, you have your own apartments and household, but you remain part of this larger machine. When you move through the palace, attendants accompany you. People bow. Servants step aside. Courtiers watch whom you acknowledge. A brief conversation can create speculation. A smile toward one faction may be interpreted as favour. Walking with the wrong person for slightly too long can become tomorrow's political discussion, and there is remarkably little silence. Footsteps strike stone floors, doors open and close, bells summon servants, horses arrive in courtyards, musicians rehearse, chapel services begin, kitchen workers shout instructions, messengers hurry between chambers. Somewhere a dog is probably contributing without authorization. At night, the palace quiets, but it does not completely sleep. Guards remain at doors, fires need tending, servants continue working, Henry's movements are still observed. If he visits your apartments, people know. If he does not visit your apartments for several nights, people know that too. This is the strange reality of being married inside a royal palace. Your home is also the seat of government. Your neighbours are also political rivals. Your hallway is also a career ladder. And every time you leave your bedroom, several hundred people are already having a very busy day inside your marriage. 9. The young Henry is annoyingly easy to understand. Here is where the story becomes more complicated, because the Henry you meet at the beginning of his reign is not yet the enormous, suspicious, increasingly immobile king staring out from the later portraits as though someone has just informed him that the pudding is Protestant. In 1509, Henry is young, energetic, handsome by contemporary standards, and very aware that he is all three. He is tall, broad-shouldered, physically active, highly educated, musical, competitive, and suddenly sitting on the throne of England at 17 years old. This is important if you are trying to understand why women could genuinely be attracted to him. You are not initially marrying a monster from a cautionary tale. You are marrying the Golden Prince. Henry rides well. He hunts enthusiastically. He dances. He plays instruments. He sings. He composes music. He enjoys theological discussion, pageantry, architecture, weapons, clothing, tournaments, and almost any activity that permits him to demonstrate that he is unusually good at being Henry. If there is a competition, he would like to enter it. If there is not a competition, he may create one. Court observers commented on his physical presence, and foreign ambassadors often described a young king who looked every inch the Renaissance prince he wanted Europe to see. He had been educated carefully in languages, religion, literature, and government, partly because, as the younger son, his original future had not necessarily been the throne. The death of his elder brother Arthur changed everything. Suddenly Henry was heir. Then his father died. And almost overnight, this extraordinarily confident young man became king. For Catherine of Aragon, the early years could feel remarkably promising. Henry married her shortly after his accession. He trusted her politically enough to leave her as regent while he campaigned in France in 1513. During that absence, English forces defeated a Scottish invasion at Flodden, and Catherine was deeply involved in the administration surrounding the crisis. This is not a marriage in which Henry initially treats his wife as decorative furniture. He values her. They share religious convictions, courtly interests, and the enormous expectation that they will establish the Tudor dynasty securely. Catherine has royal blood, intelligence, and political experience. Henry has energy and ambition. Together they make a convincing royal partnership, and there appears to have been genuine affection between them, which is inconvenient for the simpler version of the story. It would be much easier if Henry entered history unpleasant at breakfast and simply got worse from there. Instead, you can understand the attraction. He is charming when he wants to be. He gives gifts. He enjoys romantic performance. He can be generous to friends and affectionate toward people close to him. He also desperately wants admiration. That part matters. Henry grows up inside a court where people bow when he enters, laugh when appropriate, praise his accomplishments, and tell him that his judgment is exceptional. Being king does not necessarily create vanity from nothing, but it provides remarkably poor conditions for correcting it. If Henry sings, people admire the song. If Henry jousts, people admire the riding. If Henry argues theology, people admire the argument. Nobody near the throne is developing a strong professional reputation by saying, "Actually, Your Grace, that was average." So when you marry the younger Henry, daily life can be exciting. You attend tournaments where he rides beneath banners and armour. You watch him hunt across royal estates. Musicians fill chambers in the evening. Masks and disguisings turn court entertainment into elaborate theatre. Henry may appear dressed as some mysterious knight despite everyone in the room knowing perfectly well that the exceptionally tall, mysterious knight is the king. You politely remain astonished. That is part of the evening. And if he loves you, the intensity can feel extraordinary. Royal affection comes with jewels, attention, influence, letters, and the full emotional force of a man accustomed to pursuing what he wants. The difficulty is hidden inside the same quality that makes him attractive. Henry believes strongly in his own desires. As long as your wishes and his wishes move in the same direction, this can feel like confidence, devotion, and magnificent certainty. Later, when those wishes begin moving apart, it will acquire a very different name, but you do not know that yet. For now, he is young, laughing, riding hard across the fields, and turning toward you with the easy confidence of a man who has never been told that the world might eventually refuse him something. And, annoyingly, you can see why people loved him. 10. You are expected to admire his hobbies enthusiastically. Marriage to Henry also means living inside Henry's interests. And Henry has a lot of interests: hunting, jousting, archery, tennis, music, dancing, masks, weapons, horses, theology, architecture, pageantry, clothes, ships, and generally any activity that allows a large number of people to watch him being energetic and impressive. If you are his queen, these are no longer simply your husband's hobbies. They are part of court life. You attend them, applaud them, help host them, and develop the calm expression of someone who has just spent 4 hours watching men on horses attempt to knock each other unconscious with decorated poles. Henry especially loves hunting. Royal hunting is not a quiet walk through the woods with a sensible jacket and a sandwich. It is an enormous, organised event involving horses, hounds, huntsmen, servants, noblemen, ladies, equipment, food, and enough logistical preparation to suggest that England has briefly mobilised for war against a deer. You may ride with the party if your health and circumstances allow. Queens and noblewomen could participate in hunting culture, though not always in exactly the same manner as the men. Sometimes you follow the chase. Sometimes you join at particular stages. Sometimes your role is more social, accompanying the court while Henry spends several enthusiastic hours disappearing over the horizon. The important thing is that you appear interested, because Henry is very interested. In his younger years, he is an exceptional athlete by royal standards. He rides hard, shoots well, wrestles, plays tennis, and competes in tournaments with a seriousness that makes the word recreation feel slightly dishonest. Jousting is particularly important. The tournament is part sport, part theatre, part advertisement for masculine magnificence. Armour gleams, heralds announce competitors, horses are decorated, banners move above the lists. Trumpets sound. Noblemen wear devices and mottos designed to communicate qualities like courage, loyalty, mystery, and occasionally the fact that a man has spent too long thinking about his sleeve embroidery. Henry loves it. And when Henry competes, the emotional situation becomes slightly complicated because your husband is charging directly at another armoured man carrying a lance. You're expected to look supportive, probably not alarmed, certainly not bored. There is genuine danger involved. In 1536, Henry suffered a serious accident while jousting when he was thrown from his horse and trapped beneath it. Contemporary reports caused considerable alarm, and the incident became one of several physical problems that marked his later life. Whatever precise long-term effects the accident had, by then the athletic king was beginning to become a man increasingly troubled by injury and pain. But earlier, the spectacle is central to his identity. He wants to look strong because kingship itself is connected to physical strength, masculinity, courage, and martial ability. A ruler who can dominate the tournament field presents himself as a man who can dominate rather more important fields if required. Fortunately, not all Henry's hobbies involve the possibility of being flattened by a horse. He loves music deeply. He plays several instruments, maintains musicians at court, sings and composes. Music fills royal chambers during meals, ceremonies, religious observance, and evening entertainment. You may hear lutes, viols, voices, trumpets, shawms, and other instruments depending on the occasion. Henry's court is noisy in an expensive way. Then there are masks and disguisings. These entertainments allow courtiers to dress in elaborate costumes, perform dances, present allegorical scenes, and participate in carefully organised theatrical games. Henry particularly enjoys appearing in disguise, often as some heroic or romantic figure. Everyone then participates in the important court tradition of pretending not to know who he is, A remarkably tall man enters, surrounded by servants, covered in jewels, moving with the confidence of someone who owns the building. Who could it possibly be? You are astonished. Henry reveals himself. Everyone is astonished again. Excellent work all round. As his wife, you become part audience, part participant, and part symbol within this constant performance. You distribute favour, receive guests, attend celebrations, appear beside him at ceremonies, and help create the impression of a joyful, magnificent royal household. Sometimes you may genuinely enjoy it. Catherine of Aragon participated fully in the ceremonial and cultural life of Henry's early court. Anne Boleyn brought her own sophisticated tastes, shaped partly by time spent in France. Different queens influenced clothing, religion, music, patronage, and court culture in their own ways. You are not merely watching Henry's world. You help shape it. But there is one useful rule. If Henry has spent the afternoon hunting, the evening singing, and the following morning explaining his latest theological argument, try to look interested. You have married a Renaissance prince. Unfortunately, he comes with all the optional extras. 11. Eating with Henry is never just eating. It's dinner. And the good news is the food is magnificent. The bad news is that you are not simply sitting down with your husband for a quiet meal. You are taking part in another piece of royal theatre. At Henry's court, eating can display wealth, hierarchy, generosity, religious observance, political favour, and the important fact that the Tudor monarchy apparently owns enough meat to alarm the surrounding countryside. The table is not merely where you eat. It is where everyone watches who sits closest to whom, who receives which dish, who is permitted to serve the king, and whether Henry seems pleased with you while somebody carries in another roasted animal. At Hampton Court, the machinery behind this meal is enormous. The great kitchens occupy a world of their own, filled with heat, smoke, movement, and servants working around open fires. Meat turns on spits, pies bake, sauces are prepared, bread arrives in quantity, barrels of ale and wine move through storage spaces. Kitchen officers supervise an army of cooks, scullions, bakers, brewers, and carriers whose combined purpose is to ensure that the royal household does not experience anything as politically destabilizing as a late supper. Henry's court consumes astonishing quantities of food. If you are dining at the highest level, meat dominates. Beef, mutton, venison, pork, poultry, and game can appear depending on season and availability. There may be capons, swans, peacocks, herons, rabbits, and elaborate pies containing combinations that suggest Tudor cooks regarded simplicity as a personal insult. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, and nutmeg appear in wealthy cooking because imported spices remain expensive and therefore wonderfully useful for demonstrating that you can afford imported spices. Sugar performs similar work. It is still a luxury, and at court it can appear in elaborate confectionery, preserved fruits, marzipan-like marchpane, and decorative creations designed as much to impress as to nourish. A sufficiently grand feast may contain subtleties, sculpted or moulded displays placed before diners between courses. You are occasionally eating architecture. This is perhaps the only period in English history when asking whether the castle is edible requires clarification. But there are rules. The church calendar affects what can be served. On fasting days and during periods such as Lent, meat is restricted, so fish becomes enormously important. This does not necessarily mean the meal becomes modest. Wealthy households are extremely capable of interpreting religious restraint through several courses of expensive seafood. You are fasting. There are just 12 fish on the table. Please try to remain humble. Where and how you eat also depends on circumstance. Henry does not spend every meal sitting publicly beneath a canopy while hundreds of people stare at him chewing. Kings and queens could dine more privately in their chambers. But ceremonial meals matter, particularly during major feasts, visits, weddings, and diplomatic occasions. Then rank becomes visible. The king occupies the most prestigious position. You as queen have your own status and ceremonial place. Important guests are arranged according to precedence, which means dinner seating can become a beautifully upholstered mathematical problem, involving dukes, bishops, ambassadors, and at least one nobleman convinced another nobleman has been placed 3 feet too close to the monarch. Servants move constantly. Dishes arrive in carefully organised sequence. Food may be tasted or handled according to court procedures designed partly around service and partly around the ever-present fear of poisoning. Henry lived in a political world where rulers took such threats seriously, even when the practical safeguards were not remotely capable of detecting everything that might actually make food dangerous. The greatest threat to your digestion is still probably ordinary food handling. There is no refrigeration. Meat must be fresh, salted, smoked, preserved or consumed before nature begins reclaiming it. Kitchens are skilled at managing these limitations, but Tudor food safety operates without germ theory, modern sanitation, controlled storage temperatures, or anyone washing their hands while singing Happy Birthday twice. And then there is Henry himself. His eating habits change across his life. The athletic young king burns enormous energy, hunting, riding, jousting, and dancing. The older Henry moves less, suffers chronic problems with his legs, and gains considerable weight. Rich food is not the only explanation, but it certainly does not arrive to help. As his queen, you sit within this changing world. You may talk with him over dinner, you may entertain ambassadors, you may listen to music while courses arrive, you may watch his mood carefully, because even at the table royal favour remains visible. A warm remark can encourage you. A silence can worry you. A glance toward another woman can ruin the pudding entirely. Eventually the dishes are cleared. Servants remove plates and vessels. Wine continues. Conversation softens. The palace settles toward evening. You have eaten magnificently. You have also participated in religion, diplomacy, hierarchy, theatre, and possibly a minor dispute over seating precedence. And you thought dinner with your in-laws was stressful. 12. Royal affection functions like a weather system. Now let's talk about Henry liking you. Because when your husband is also King of England, affection is not merely an emotion shared between two people. It has consequences. If Henry is pleased with you, the entire court seems brighter. Gifts arrive, invitations become easier. Your relatives discover that offices previously unavailable to them have suddenly become surprisingly obtainable. Petitioners appear in your chambers. Courtiers who barely noticed your family 6 months ago now remember that they have always admired them enormously. Henry smiles at you across dinner, and somewhere nearby your uncle's career improves. This is royal favour, and it operates almost like weather. When the sun is shining, everybody wants to stand near you. When the clouds appear, people begin quietly looking for shelter. You see this very clearly with Anne Boleyn. During Henry's long pursuit of her, his attention is intense. He writes love letters, sends gifts, seeks her company, and spends years trying to create the circumstances in which he can marry her. Anne occupies an extraordinary position because Henry's desire for her becomes tangled with his determination to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. For a time, being loved by Henry makes Anne one of the most important people in England before she is even queen. Her family rises with her. Her father receives honours and diplomatic responsibilities. Her brother George becomes prominent at court. Men who support Anne and the religious and political changes surrounding the king's great matter gain opportunities. This is what happens when Henry loves you. Your relatives become a government department. But royal affection carries a problem that ordinary affection does not. Everyone can see it changing. Henry does not need to gather the household and announce that he is becoming less interested in you. He simply starts behaving differently. Perhaps visits to your chambers become less frequent. Perhaps gifts become less extravagant. Perhaps he spends more time hunting without you. Perhaps another woman begins receiving the kind of attention you recognize because you once received exactly the same attention yourself. The court notices immediately. Courtiers survive by reading tiny changes in royal behaviour. They watch where Henry sits, whom he speaks to, whose jokes make him laugh, whose petitions he accepts, who receives presents, and who suddenly discovers that the king is too busy to see them. You may still officially be the most important woman in England, but if Henry's attention is moving elsewhere, everyone begins recalculating. This is one of the cruelest aspects of Anne Boleyn's position when Jane Seymour begins attracting Henry's interest. Anne understands perfectly well what royal pursuit looks like. She has lived through it from the other side. Now she watches another woman occupy the space she herself once occupied beside Catherine of Aragon. There is no comforting ignorance available. Jane's family notices too. The Seymours understand that Henry's interest in Jane may create opportunities, and they help protect and advance her position. Jane is presented as modest and restrained, a deliberate contrast to the increasingly embattled Anne. By early 1536, the emotional climate around the Queen has become dangerously cold. Then Anne miscarries a male fetus in January. For Henry, already anxious about the succession, The loss appears to deepen the crisis in the marriage. Within months, Anne's enemies move against her. She is arrested in May, tried on charges including adultery and treason, and executed. Whether Henry's fading affection directly caused the machinery of her destruction is more complicated than a simple story of a husband becoming bored. Politics, faction, succession, Thomas Cromwell's role, and the extraordinary accusations made against Anne all matter. But from your position as queen, the practical lesson is difficult to miss. Love does not protect you once favour disappears, and royal favour rarely disappears quietly. Catherine of Aragon had experienced a slower version. For years, Henry treated her with respect and affection. They shared a court, a daughter, political responsibilities, and repeated grief over lost pregnancies. Then Henry's desperation for a male heir transformed the marriage. By the time he pursued Anne, Catherine found herself defending not merely her husband's love but her title, her daughter's legitimacy, and the validity of more than 20 years of married life. So you learn to watch Henry closely. A kiss matters, a gift matters, a cancelled visit matters. A new woman at court can matter very much indeed. And the worst thing is that everybody else is watching too. When Henry loves you, the palace feels warm. When Henry stops loving you, you may notice the temperature falling long before anyone has the courage to tell you it is winter. 13. The royal bedchamber comes with a national audience. Let's move carefully toward the bedroom. Because in Henry VIII's marriage, even the most private room in the palace is not entirely private. The door can close, curtains can be drawn around the bed, servants can withdraw. But outside those walls sits an entire court with a professional interest in whether the king and queen are sleeping together, whether the marriage has been consummated, whether you might be pregnant, and whether the Tudor dynasty appears likely to survive another generation. Nothing creates intimacy quite like knowing Europe is waiting for results. The royal bedchamber itself can be magnificent. A great bed may be raised from the floor, surrounded by richly embroidered hangings, curtains, cushions, carpets, and expensive textiles designed to keep out both cold air and anyone who has forgotten that you are extremely important. Fires burn nearby when necessary, candles provide light. Furniture, religious objects, and personal possessions soften the chamber into something recognisably domestic. And then you remember that several people probably know what time Henry arrived. Royal households operate through service. Somebody prepares the room, somebody makes the bed, somebody tends the fire, somebody brings water, somebody knows whether the king has ordered that he will spend the night with you. Those details matter because marriage at this level is not only companionship, it is succession. If Henry visits regularly, courtiers may take it as a reassuring sign. If those visits become less frequent, the silence can become equally informative. Nobody needs access to the actual bed to understand that a marriage is changing. The entire palace is very good at noticing patterns. This becomes especially important because consummation can carry legal consequences. Catherine of Aragon's first marriage to Henry's older brother Arthur would eventually become the centre of Henry's attempt to end his own marriage to her. Catherine consistently maintained that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Decades later, men who had never been inside that long-ago bedroom would spend remarkable amounts of time discussing what had or had not happened there. Imagine being asked to prove the details of your wedding night 20 years after the event because your husband has developed an interest in someone else. Tudor marriage law is not relaxing. Anne of Cleves encounters the same issue in another form. Henry later claimed that his marriage to Anne had not been consummated. He discussed the matter with members of his council in terms so personal that Anne's ability to remain dignified through the whole episode deserves considerably more admiration than it usually receives. The king complained about attraction. He discussed his physical response to her. Officials gathered information. And Anne, who had crossed Europe to become Queen of England, eventually found herself participating in an annulment partly built around what had not happened in her bed. This is why your royal bedroom is simultaneously private, religious, and political territory. And then there is pregnancy. The first missed monthly cycle can transform quiet speculation into excitement. Your ladies may notice changes before anyone else does. Physicians can be consulted. Prayers may begin. Henry becomes interested. Ambassadors hear rumours. Soon a French diplomat may know that you have felt nauseous in the morning. This is an extraordinary amount of international attention for someone who would mostly like to lie down. Even when pregnancy is not involved, sleeping arrangements tell the court something about favour. Henry might spend evenings in his own apartments, visit yours, or maintain separate routines dictated by ceremony, illness, travel, or personal preference. Royal couples do not necessarily share a bed every night in the modern domestic sense. But when behaviour changes noticeably, observers begin attaching meaning to it. This must be one of the strangest emotional pressures of queenship. A difficult week with your husband cannot simply remain a difficult week. If Henry stays away, servants know. Courtiers notice. Your enemies may become optimistic. Your allies become nervous. By breakfast, your marriage has market indicators. So, when the doors finally close and the chamber grows quiet, you do receive a degree of privacy. The candles burn low, the tapestries soften the room, voices retreat into the corridor. Perhaps, for a little while, you are simply a woman beside her husband rather than the Queen of England beside the King. But beyond the door, the household is still awake. Somebody knows Henry came in. Somebody will know when he leaves. And by tomorrow afternoon, there is a reasonable chance half the diplomatic community will have developed an opinion about it. 14. Your body has now become government infrastructure. Once you are queen, your body stops belonging entirely to you in a way that is difficult to imagine from the modern world. Whether you sleep well matters, whether you eat matters. Whether you are tired, pale, feverish, nauseous, unusually cheerful, or seen putting a hand thoughtfully against your stomach can become information. Most importantly, whether your monthly cycle arrives on schedule is suddenly of intense interest to people who have absolutely no business knowing about it, and yet somehow represents several European governments. Because Henry does not simply need a wife, he needs heirs. More specifically, he wants a legitimate son who can inherit the throne, without England having to spend the next generation arguing about succession with swords. The Tudor dynasty is still relatively young. Henry's father, Henry VII, had won the crown at Bosworth in 1485 after decades of dynastic conflict now remembered as the Wars of the Roses. The memory of disputed inheritance, rival claimants, rebellion, and civil war is not distant history to Henry. It is family history. So when you marry him, your fertility immediately acquires constitutional importance. If your period is late, people notice. Your ladies may know first because they are responsible for your linen and clothing. If you begin feeling sick in the morning, someone notices that too. If your appetite changes, your attendants may quietly wonder whether this is finally the sign everyone has been waiting for. Then the rumours begin. Nobody announces anything too early because pregnancies can be uncertain, particularly before the body changes visibly. But court gossip requires very little encouragement. Within days, someone may tell an ambassador that the Queen is believed to be with child. The ambassador writes home. Suddenly, your mild nausea is foreign policy. This happened repeatedly during Henry's marriages because every possible pregnancy carried enormous expectations. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant many times during her marriage, but most of those pregnancies ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or children who died very young. Their daughter Mary, born in 1516, survived. Mary is a healthy royal child. She is loved, educated, and clearly capable. Unfortunately, she is not a boy. At first, this is disappointing rather than catastrophic. Henry and Catherine are still relatively young. There is every reason to expect more children. So everyone waits and waits. Each pregnancy renews hope. Each loss becomes not merely family grief, but a dynastic setback. This is where the pressure on you becomes almost unbearable. Your reproductive life is interpreted publicly while remaining completely beyond your control. You can eat carefully by Tudor standards. You can pray. You can follow medical advice. You can rest. You can surround yourself with experienced women. None of this guarantees a son. Tudor medicine understands almost nothing about genetics, which is particularly unfortunate because the sex of the child will eventually be treated as though it somehow reflects your performance. No one knows that Henry is the one supplying the chromosome that determines whether the baby is male. Biology is still several centuries away from clearing that up, so the Queen receives the pressure. Anne Boleyn experiences this brutally. Her first child with Henry Elizabeth is born in 1533. Henry had expected a boy strongly enough that official documents prepared for the birth reportedly had to be altered after the baby turned out to be female. Elizabeth is healthy. The kingdom has gained another legitimate royal child. Everybody responds with the Tudor equivalent of, "Yes, lovely. But what else have you got?" Anne becomes pregnant again, but no surviving son follows. When she miscarries a male fetus in January of 1536, the political consequences are severe. The marriage is already under strain, and Henry increasingly begins to see the repeated reproductive failure as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong. For you, this means every month carries tension. Your own body becomes a calendar watched by the court. If there is no pregnancy, people worry. If there is a pregnancy, people worry differently. If you miscarry, they search for meaning. If you give birth to a daughter, they congratulate you while mentally calculating how quickly you might become pregnant again. And if you finally produce a son, as Jane Seymour does in 1537, the country erupts in celebration. You have succeeded. The dynasty has its heir. You have given Henry exactly what he wanted. Unfortunately, even then your body is not finished paying for it. Because queenship can give you palaces, jewels, servants, influence, and extraordinary status. What it cannot give you is control over childbirth, biology, or the terrifying expectations attached to either. You are Queen of England, and apparently your womb now has a foreign policy department. 15. Pregnancy immediately becomes everyone else's project. You're pregnant, which is wonderful news, except that within approximately 5 minutes it stops feeling like information about your own body and starts behaving like an announcement from the Privy Council. A royal pregnancy is never simply yours. It belongs to Henry, the dynasty, the court, the church, several physicians, a collection of anxious ladies, and foreign ambassadors who are now suddenly extremely interested in whether you felt sick before breakfast. At first, nobody can be completely certain. There are no pregnancy tests, no scans, no neat little line appearing on a plastic stick while Henry waits nervously outside the bathroom. Early pregnancy is identified through missed monthly bleeding, changes in appetite, nausea, physical symptoms, and the accumulated experience of women who have spent their lives watching other women become pregnant. Your ladies notice things. You are tired. You dislike a food you normally enjoy. Your clothing begins fitting differently. Someone quietly mentions that your monthly cycle has not arrived, and immediately the palace develops hope. Henry wants confirmation, but Tudor medicine cannot provide the kind of certainty you would find comforting. Physicians may examine urine, discuss symptoms, and offer learned opinions based on medical traditions inherited from antiquity. Experienced midwives and female attendants may be considerably more useful because they have actually seen hundreds of pregnancies develop. Everyone has an opinion. Nobody has ultrasound. So the safest answer for several weeks is essentially probably. This does not prevent anyone celebrating. Once the pregnancy is accepted as genuine, prayers are offered for you. Religious services may mark the hope surrounding the unborn child. Your household becomes increasingly protective. Food, rest, movement, and physical exertion receive attention. Advice comes from physicians, older women, relatives, clergy, and probably someone who once knew a woman whose cousin had a particularly successful pregnancy after eating pears. Pregnancy advice has never struggled for volunteers. You are encouraged to avoid shocks, frightening sights, dangerous exertion, and anything believed capable of disturbing the child. Tudor medical thinking still accepts ideas about maternal imagination, the possibility that a pregnant woman's experiences or emotions might somehow mark or influence the developing baby, so everyone would quite like you to remain calm. This is especially useful because you are currently carrying the future of the Tudor dynasty inside you. Very relaxing. If you are Catherine of Aragon, this cycle becomes heartbreakingly familiar. Catherine became pregnant repeatedly during her marriage to Henry. Some pregnancies ended early. Some children were stillborn. A son named Henry was born on New Year's Day in 1511 and caused enormous celebration, only to die less than 2 months later. Imagine what that does to the next pregnancy. Every hopeful sign comes carrying memory. Every successful month brings relief mixed with fear. When Mary is born in 1516 and survives infancy, there is genuine joy. Henry loves his daughter and celebrates her birth. But the expectation remains that a son will eventually follow. For Anne Boleyn, the pressure is even sharper because Henry has already torn apart his first marriage partly in pursuit of a male heir. Anne becomes pregnant quickly after marrying Henry. Her condition is therefore not simply welcome, it is vindication. Surely this proves everything. Surely God approves. Surely the child will be the prince Henry has waited for. Preparations begin with extraordinary confidence. Then Elizabeth is born, a healthy daughter, a future queen of enormous historical importance. And at that particular moment, an administrative inconvenience because everyone had prepared for a boy. The public celebrations continue, but expectations immediately move forward. Perhaps next time, that phrase will follow you everywhere. If you become pregnant again, hope rises again. Courtiers calculate. Ambassadors report. Henry watches. Your enemies watch Henry watching. And meanwhile, you are actually pregnant. Your back aches, your body changes, clothing becomes uncomfortable. You may feel exhausted, sick, hungry, anxious, or perfectly well until somebody asks for the 8th time whether you are resting enough. The remarkable thing is how quickly the woman disappears behind the pregnancy. People are not merely asking how you feel. They are asking what you are carrying. A boy means security. A girl means another attempt. A loss means grief followed almost immediately by political interpretation. So you place your hands over your growing stomach and continue through the months as calmly as you can. The palace waits with you. England waits with you. Europe occasionally receives updates. And somewhere in your apartments, surrounded by experienced women and far too much advice, you begin to understand that becoming pregnant was the private part. Everything after that belongs to everyone else. 16. Confinement turns your bedroom into a beautiful furnace. Now you're nearing childbirth, and just when you thought pregnancy had already involved an unreasonable number of people, Tudor custom decides the solution is to place you in a darkened room with even more women. As the birth approaches, you enter what is known as confinement, or lying in, a period when an elite woman withdraws from ordinary court life and prepares to give birth inside specially arranged chambers. You stop appearing publicly. Men largely disappear from your immediate surroundings. Doors close. Curtains are drawn. Fires are lit. And your bedroom slowly becomes something between a chapel, a nursery, and an extremely expensive greenhouse. The ritual begins before labour. Your chambers are prepared carefully, often with rich tapestries and heavy fabrics covering walls and windows. Drafts are considered dangerous, so outside air is kept firmly where Tudor medicine believes it belongs. Outside, windows may be shuttered or covered. Curtains soften the light. The room is kept warm, sometimes aggressively warm, because cold air is thought capable of harming both mother and child. This sounds comforting until you remember that childbirth itself involves considerable physical exertion. You are now doing that beside a large fire in a room designed to prevent fresh air from entering. Very restful. Religious imagery also matters. Childbirth is dangerous enough that spiritual preparation is not decorative. Prayers are said. Holy objects may be kept nearby. The entire atmosphere is intended to create a protected female space in which you can prepare physically and spiritually for what everyone knows may become dangerous very quickly. And everyone does know. Nobody in the 16th century needs a medical textbook to explain that women sometimes die giving birth. Families have seen it. Midwives have seen it repeatedly. Women enter confinement carrying not only hope, but the quiet awareness that they may not emerge from it. So you prepare. Your ladies remain with you. Experienced attendants help manage the final weeks. A midwife may be summoned when labour begins. Female relatives or trusted companions can also be present, depending on circumstances. The chamber becomes a world almost entirely run by women. This is unusual in a society where formal political and legal authority overwhelmingly belongs to men. For these hours, however, Henry cannot simply walk in and take command because he is king. He waits. You do the difficult part. The practical knowledge inside the room can be considerable. Experienced midwives understand the stages of labour, positions that may help, methods of comforting the mother, and signs that something is going wrong. Much of their knowledge has been accumulated through generations of direct observation. The problem arrives when something genuinely serious happens. There are no antibiotics. There are no blood transfusions. There is no modern surgery waiting beyond the chamber door. There is no reliable understanding of infection. If labour becomes obstructed, if severe bleeding begins, or if fever follows the delivery, everyone is suddenly operating at the edge of what 16th century medicine can manage. Jane Seymour's experience shows just how brutal that reality could be. In October of 1537, Jane entered confinement at Hampton Court and gave birth to Henry's long-awaited son Edward. The birth brought enormous celebration. After years of failed pregnancies, infant deaths, marital upheaval, and national anxiety, the Tudor dynasty finally had its legitimate male heir. Henry had what he wanted. Jane became the woman who had given it to him. Then she became gravely ill. Less than 2 weeks after Edward's birth, she died. The precise nature of her final illness cannot be diagnosed with complete certainty from surviving records, though complications following childbirth and infection have long been considered likely explanations. For you, none of those later medical debates matter. You only know the room, the heat, the curtains, the whispered prayers, the women moving quietly around the bed. Outside, the palace waits for news. Inside, nobody can promise what the news will be. And this is perhaps the strangest part of royal confinement. Everything surrounding you is designed to display security. Thick carpets, fine linen, fires, servants, food, physicians nearby. The best resources the Tudor monarchy can provide. You are wrapped in privilege. You are also facing childbirth with almost exactly the same biological vulnerabilities as every other woman in England. The crown can make your chamber beautiful. It cannot make childbirth safe. So the curtains remain closed, the fire burns, the room grows warmer, and somewhere beyond the door Henry waits for someone to tell him whether England has gained an heir. You would personally settle for some fresh air. 17. Childbirth is the appointment you cannot cancel. Let's talk about the part everyone knows is coming, and nobody can make safe. Because once labour begins, all the velvet, jewels, titles, servants, prayers, and royal authority in England becomes strangely irrelevant. You are Queen of England, married to one of the most powerful men in Europe, surrounded by the finest assistants money can obtain, and yet your body is about to undertake something that Tudor medicine has only a limited ability to control. Henry can command armies, he can summon Parliament, he can quarrel with the Pope, he cannot order childbirth to proceed nicely. The first signs may begin quietly. A tightening across your abdomen, a pain that disappears and returns. Your attendants watch closely. The midwife is summoned. Fires attended. Linen is prepared. Women move through the chamber with the practiced efficiency of people who understand that excitement is not particularly useful now. Henry waits elsewhere. This is largely a female space. Birth traditionally belongs to women, particularly experienced midwives and attendants who have seen labour many times before. They know how to support you, when to encourage movement, how to judge the progress of labour, and which positions may help. You are not necessarily lying flat on your back. You may walk while you still can. You may kneel, sit, crouch, or use a birthing stool. Women have been giving birth for thousands of years and have developed a considerable body of practical knowledge, without anyone needing to invent fluorescent hospital lighting. What you do not have is reliable pain relief. There is no epidural waiting downstairs. There is no anaesthetist checking paperwork. You have comfort, prayer, warm drinks, physical support, and whatever remedies your attendants believe useful. Then you have the contraction itself, which is less interested in Tudor medical theory. Hours may pass. For many women, the birth proceeds successfully. This matters because it is easy to look backward from the modern world and imagine childbirth as automatically fatal. It was not. Most women survived their individual deliveries. But the danger was real enough that nobody treated the event casually. Severe bleeding can kill you. A baby positioned badly can turn a normal labour into an emergency. A prolonged labour can exhaust both mother and child. If the placenta does not deliver properly, there are limited options. If infection develops afterward, the danger may not become obvious until the supposedly successful birth is already being celebrated. And there is almost nothing anyone can do about some of these complications. That is the frightening part. Your attendants may be experienced, intelligent, and completely dedicated to keeping you alive. They are still working centuries before antibiotics, blood transfusion, antiseptic surgery, and modern obstetrics. Skill can help enormously. Skill cannot manufacture technology that does not exist yet. Eventually, perhaps after hours of pain and encouragement, the child arrives, and immediately somebody wants to know the sex. You have barely had time to breathe. Is it a prince? That question hangs over every royal birth because Henry's marriage has made this baby into more than a baby. If the answer is yes, celebration can begin almost immediately. Bells may ring, Te Deums can be sung. News travels from palace to city, from court to ambassador, from England across Europe. If the answer is a daughter, there is still celebration. just with a small invisible asterisk beside it. Then the attention turns back toward you, because delivering the child is not the end of the danger. Jane Seymour demonstrated that with devastating clarity. She gave Henry the son he had wanted for decades when Edward was born in October of 1537. The kingdom celebrated. Henry had a legitimate male heir at last. Jane initially appeared to have survived the birth. Then she became ill. Within 12 days, she was dead. For Henry, Jane's death seems to have carried genuine emotional weight. She was later buried beside him at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the only one of his wives to share his final burial place. But none of that could help her in the chamber, and that is what you understand while labouring in yours. Being queen has given you the best room, the finest linen, experienced attendants, excellent food, and people praying specifically for your survival. It has not given you certainty. So you grip someone's hand, listen to the voices around you, and keep going because there is nothing else to do. For perhaps the first time since marrying Henry, nobody wants you to smile, dance, entertain ambassadors, or look magnificent. You have one job. Get yourself and the child through the night, and even the King of England has to wait outside and hope. 18. A daughter is wonderful and also somehow a problem. The baby arrives. She is healthy. She is legitimate. She has 10 fingers, 10 toes, a royal father, a royal mother, and absolutely no understanding that half the court is staring at her with the polite expression of people who had been hoping for someone else. Because if you are Henry VIII's queen, giving birth to a daughter is not failure. Everyone will tell you that. There will be prayers, gifts, congratulations, music, ceremonies, and carefully worded expressions of joy. It is simply that beneath all this happiness sits one rather obvious question. When are you going to have a son? Catherine of Aragon encounters this problem first. After several pregnancies ended in loss, she gives birth to a healthy daughter, Mary, in 1516. Henry is genuinely pleased. Mary is his legitimate child, a princess, and for years she is treated as an important dynastic asset. She receives an excellent education, a substantial household, and marriage negotiations begin while she is still young because apparently childhood at royal level is mostly preparation for future paperwork. But Henry still expects a son. At first, this expectation is not unreasonable by contemporary standards. Catherine is still capable of having more children, and royal couples often produce several. A daughter can marry a foreign prince and strengthen alliances. A son can inherit England. So, Mary is celebrated, and everyone waits for her brother. The problem is that he never arrives. As Catherine grows older and further pregnancies fail, Mary's sex becomes more politically important. England has had powerful queens and female claimants before, but there is no recent precedent. Henry finds comfortably reassuring for a woman inheriting the Tudor throne without dispute. His anxiety grows. Then Anne Boleyn becomes queen. Anne's position is even more precarious because Henry has spent years overturning his first marriage and transforming the religious and legal structure around the monarchy, partly to make their union possible. When Anne becomes pregnant, expectations are enormous. Astrologers and courtiers confidently predict a boy. Preparations for a prince move forward. Henry has invested too much politically and personally for anyone near him to sound uncertain. Then, in September of 1533, Anne gives birth. To Elizabeth, the child is healthy, the mother survives, the birth itself is successful, and somewhere in the administrative machinery, documents prepared for the arrival of a prince reportedly require alteration. It is difficult to imagine a more Tudor problem. You have just delivered one of the most significant monarchs in English history, and people are mildly inconvenienced because the stationery is wrong. Elizabeth receives the honours appropriate to a royal daughter. She is given a household and recognised as Henry's legitimate heir under the new settlement. But the pressure on Anne begins again almost immediately. One daughter is not enough. The marriage still needs a son. And this is where the experience becomes emotionally brutal, because the daughter in your arms is not an abstract dynastic disappointment. She is your child. You know her face. You hear her cry. You watch attendants carry her through rooms prepared specifically for her. You may feel enormous relief that she is alive after everything childbirth can do to you. Meanwhile, outside the nursery, men are already discussing succession. The irony becomes almost unbearable with hindsight. Mary will eventually become Queen of England. Elizabeth will eventually become Queen of England. Both daughters Henry regarded as inadequate solutions to his succession problem will sit on his throne. Elizabeth will reign for more than 4 decades. Henry spends an extraordinary portion of his life worrying that women cannot secure the Tudor dynasty, only for the Tudor dynasty to become most famous under one of those women. History can be extremely patient with a punchline, but you do not know that while holding your newborn daughter, you only know the rules of the world around you. A princess is valuable. A prince is necessary. So everyone congratulates you warmly. Henry may kiss you. The court celebrates. Your baby sleeps peacefully, unaware that she has already become part of a national succession debate. And before you have fully recovered from producing one human being, England begins quietly wondering when you might produce another. 19. Losing a pregnancy is both grief and political evidence. Now comes one of the cruelest parts of marrying Henry. Because if you lose a pregnancy, you are not allowed the luxury of having that loss mean only what it means to you. You are grieving a child. Your body is recovering. You may be exhausted, frightened, in pain, and surrounded by women who understand exactly how dangerous pregnancy can be. But outside your chamber, the court is already doing something colder. It is interpreting what happened. A miscarriage is not simply a tragedy, it becomes evidence. Evidence about your fertility. Evidence about the marriage. Evidence about God's opinion. And eventually, perhaps, evidence that Henry should consider doing something drastic. Catherine of Aragon knows this pattern better than almost anyone. During her long marriage to Henry, she becomes pregnant repeatedly. Some pregnancies end in miscarriage or stillbirth. Some children live only briefly. In 1511, Catherine gives birth to a son, Prince Henry, and the celebrations are enormous. England finally has the male heir everyone has wanted. Tournament festivities begin. Poets rejoice. The young king is delighted. Then, less than 2 months later, the baby dies. The joy simply collapses. Catherine becomes pregnant again. Hope returns. Then loss returns with it. And because royal pregnancies are public affairs, royal grief is public too. You cannot simply disappear for 6 months and tell everyone you would rather not discuss it. Ambassadors report what happened. Courts abroad learn whether the child was male or female. Henry's counsellors reconsider the succession. Religious explanations hover over everything because Tudor England understands reproduction through a mixture of medicine, theology, experience, and things nobody can actually prove. Was the loss God's will? Of course. But what does God's will mean? That question is where things become dangerous. Henry eventually begins to interpret his lack of surviving sons with Catherine through Scripture. He becomes convinced that marrying his brother's widow has placed him under divine judgment, drawing particularly on passages in Leviticus warning that such unions would be childless. There is one obvious inconvenience with this argument. Henry and Catherine are not childless. Mary exists. But by the time Henry wants an explanation, theology is required to become flexible enough to accommodate the emotional situation. For Catherine, this must have been devastating. The pregnancies she lost were personal suffering. Years later, Henry effectively turns that suffering into part of the case against their marriage. The grief becomes paperwork. Anne Boleyn experiences an even more immediate version. Anne gives Henry Elizabeth in 1533, then suffers further unsuccessful pregnancies. In January of 1536, she miscarries a male fetus. The timing could hardly be worse. Catherine of Aragon has died only weeks earlier. Henry is already paying attention to Jane Seymour. Anne's position depends heavily on giving him the son he believed this second marriage would finally provide. Then she loses one. Later reports attribute bitter words to Henry after the miscarriage, suggesting that he believed Anne would never give him sons. The exact conversations surrounding the event are difficult to reconstruct with certainty, but the political result is unmistakable. Within months, Anne is dead. The miscarriage does not by itself cause her fall. Court faction, Henry's changing feelings, Thomas Cromwell's manoeuvring, and the accusations eventually brought against her all matter. But the loss weakens her at precisely the moment when weakness is most dangerous. For you, this means recovery comes with an audience. Your attendants help wash you. Fresh linen is brought. You remain in bed while your strength slowly returns. And outside, people are asking whether you can conceive again. Nobody needs to be deliberately cruel for the system itself to feel cruel. Henry may grieve too. He lost these children as well. But he possesses something you do not. Options. If repeated pregnancies fail, the king can begin wondering whether another wife might produce a different result. You cannot simply replace Henry with a more reproductively promising husband. The arrangement is not symmetrical, so after the loss, you pray, you recover, you try to sleep, you listen to the quiet movement of your ladies around the chamber, and eventually someone begins discussing when you might be well enough to return to ordinary court life, because that is what happens next. The palace continues, Henry continues, the succession problem continues, and the child you lost becomes another entry in a political calculation that everyone else is already making before you have even stopped grieving. 20. The male heir question eventually eats the marriage. Let's talk about the son, because sooner or later, almost every problem inside Henry VIII's marriages begins circling back to the same empty cradle. Henry wants a legitimate male heir, and not merely because he personally prefers boys or enjoys the idea of seeing a smaller version of himself charging around the palace. The Tudor dynasty is still young. His father took the throne after years of dynastic warfare, and Henry has grown up knowing that disputed succession can turn aristocratic disagreement into several decades of people meeting in fields with weapons. A son promises certainty. At least that is the theory. Catherine of Aragon spends years trying to provide one. She becomes pregnant repeatedly. A son is born in 1511 and dies less than 2 months later. Other pregnancies end unsuccessfully. Mary survives, grows into an intelligent and healthy princess, and for a time, Henry can still reasonably hope that a brother will follow. But the years pass. Catherine grows older. The pregnancies stop, and Henry begins looking at the future with increasing anxiety. This is where a private disappointment gradually becomes what contemporaries call the king's great matter, which is an impressively dignified title for a marital crisis involving one increasingly impatient husband, one completely determined wife, several European monarchs, a pope, and enough lawyers to fill a modest cathedral. Henry wants his marriage annulled. His argument focuses on Catherine's previous marriage to his elder brother Arthur. Henry becomes convinced that Scripture condemns his union with his brother's widow, and that the absence of surviving sons is evidence of divine displeasure. Catherine disagrees, very firmly. She insists that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, and that her marriage to Henry is therefore entirely lawful. The papal dispensation permitting their union had already addressed the issue. More importantly, Catherine believes with absolute conviction that she is Henry's true wife and Queen of England. So Henry has a problem. He cannot simply tell Catherine that things are not working and suggest they remain friends. A royal marriage is a religious and diplomatic institution. Catherine is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Her nephew is Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most powerful men in Europe. The Pope cannot casually invalidate the marriage without consequences. Henry waits. Negotiations continue. Nothing happens quickly enough. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn is waiting too. Henry's attraction to Anne does not create his concern about the succession from nothing, but it gives that concern a very immediate solution. If the first marriage is invalid, Henry can marry Anne. Anne is younger. Anne might give him sons. Suddenly, theology and desire are travelling in exactly the same direction. This is dangerous for Catherine because Henry increasingly treats the absence of a male heir not as unfortunate chance but as proof that the marriage itself is wrong. Think about what that means from your side of the bed. You have been married for more than 20 years. You have served as queen faithfully. You have represented Henry politically, even acting as regent while he campaigned in France. You have endured repeated pregnancies, losses, and the death of children you desperately wanted. And now those losses are being presented as evidence that you should never have been Henry's wife in the first place. That is an extraordinary way to have your grief returned to you. The crisis eventually transforms England. When papal approval does not come, Henry's government moves toward rejecting papal jurisdiction. Parliament passes legislation establishing royal authority over the English Church. Thomas Cranmer becomes Archbishop of Canterbury and declares Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid in 1533. Henry then marries Anne, but the son still does not arrive. Anne gives birth to Elizabeth, suffers further unsuccessful pregnancies, and eventually loses a male fetus in 1536. Now Henry confronts the deeply inconvenient possibility that replacing the wife has not solved the biological problem, so he replaces the wife again. Jane Seymour finally gives him Edward in 1537. After nearly 3 decades of anxiety, Henry has his legitimate son. 1 boy. That is the astonishing part. 6 marriages, enormous religious upheaval, Broken alliances, destroyed careers, 2 executed queens, and decades of political obsession eventually produce one surviving legitimate male heir. Edward will become king. He will also die at 15. Meanwhile, Mary and Elizabeth, the daughters who were never considered adequate solutions, will both inherit the throne. Henry spends much of his reign fearing that a woman cannot secure the Tudor succession. History eventually hands England to his daughters anyway. It is almost offensively well written. 21. Your husband can turn theology into divorce proceedings. Now the lawyers arrive. Because when Henry decides his marriage to Catherine of Aragon is spiritually invalid, this does not remain a private crisis between husband and wife. It becomes a legal, theological, diplomatic, and eventually constitutional problem involving bishops, canon lawyers, university scholars, ambassadors, parliament, the Pope, and a steadily growing pile of documents explaining why the King of England would very much like everyone to agree that his marriage of nearly 20 years has technically been a mistake. Henry's argument begins with Catherine's first husband. Before marrying Henry, Catherine had been married to his older brother Arthur. Arthur died in 1502, only months after their wedding. Catherine always maintained that the marriage had never been consummated, meaning that when she later married Henry, she was not truly entering the forbidden union Henry would eventually claim she was. At the time, everybody understood there might be a legal problem, so a papal dispensation was obtained. This is important. Henry did not accidentally wake up one morning and discover that he had unknowingly married his brother's widow. The issue had been considered before the wedding. Rome had authorized the marriage. Henry then spent years apparently accepting it as valid. Then the lack of surviving sons begins to weigh on him, and suddenly, Leviticus becomes fascinating. Henry focuses particularly on the biblical warning that a man who takes his brother's wife commits an offense and that such a union will be childless. Henry increasingly interprets his dynastic disappointments as evidence that God has condemned the marriage. There is an immediate complication. He has a child. Mary is very much alive. The argument therefore requires childless to mean, in practical terms, without surviving sons. Theology is already working overtime. Catherine's supporters point toward another biblical passage in Deuteronomy, where a man is instructed under certain circumstances to marry his deceased brother's widow. Canon lawyers debate how these passages should be interpreted. Scholars examine whether the Pope possessed authority to dispense with the impediment in the first place. Henry is not merely asking for a divorce. Strictly speaking, he wants an annulment. The distinction matters. Divorce would suggest that a valid marriage existed and was now being ended. Henry's position is that the marriage should never have been valid at all, which must be fascinating news to Catherine after nearly 2 decades as his wife. Henry sends representatives to Rome. Cardinal Wolsey attempts to solve the problem. Papal legates become involved. In 1529, a special court meets at Blackfriars in London to consider the marriage, and Catherine does something unforgettable. She kneels before Henry. She appeals directly to him, defending her marriage, her honour, and the truth of her claim that she had been a virgin when she married him. Then she refuses to recognise the court's authority and leaves. This is not the submissive exit Henry wants. Catherine is remarkably difficult to move because she believes she is right. The Pope, Clement VII, is also in an awkward position. Catherine's nephew is Emperor Charles V, whose political power in Italy makes offending him an unattractive career choice. So Rome delays. Henry grows increasingly frustrated. Years pass. Anne Boleyn remains nearby. And what began as a question about one marriage gradually becomes a question about who possesses ultimate authority inside England. If the Pope will not give Henry what he wants, perhaps England no longer needs the Pope to make the decision. That thought changes everything. Parliament begins passing laws restricting papal authority. English clergy are pressured into recognising the king's supremacy. Thomas Cranmer becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1533, Cranmer declares Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn valid. Shortly afterward, Anne is crowned. Catherine does not agree. She never agrees. She continues regarding herself as Henry's lawful wife until her death. And this is the extraordinary scale of what has happened. You started with one king asking whether he could leave one queen. You ended with England rejecting papal jurisdiction and the monarch emerging as supreme head of the English Church. Most husbands going through a midlife crisis buy something unnecessary. Henry reorganises ecclesiastical authority. 22. Catherine of Aragon. simply refuses to stop being queen. Let's spend some time with Catherine. Because if Henry expects his first wife to quietly accept that 24 years of marriage have somehow become an administrative misunderstanding, he has badly misjudged the woman involved. Catherine of Aragon is not an obscure noblewoman. Henry can move to a country house with a generous pension and a polite instruction to stop causing difficulties. She is the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, raised from childhood to understand royalty, religion, diplomacy, and the importance of never appearing uncertain when several powerful men would very much prefer that you were. And Catherine believes she is right. Completely right. She maintains that her brief marriage to Henry's elder brother Arthur was never consummated. Therefore, as far as she is concerned, there was no biblical obstacle preventing her later marriage to Henry. A papal dispensation had been obtained. She had married Henry openly, been crowned beside him, shared his throne for decades, acted as his queen, and given birth to his legitimate daughter. Now Henry would like her to agree that none of this counted. Catherine declines. The most dramatic moment comes during the proceedings at Blackfriars in 1529. Henry and Catherine appear before the legatine court convened to examine the validity of their marriage. Catherine rises, crosses the room, and kneels before Henry. Then she appeals directly to him. She reminds him that she has been his true and obedient wife. She insists that she came to him a virgin. She asks what offence she has committed to deserve being cast aside after so many years. It is an extraordinary scene. Henry wants canon law. Catherine gives him 20 years of marriage. Then she refuses to recognise the court's authority and leaves. She does not come back. This is the Tudor equivalent of ending the meeting by taking the agenda with you. Henry continues pursuing the annulment, but Catherine's refusal creates a serious problem because she possesses something he cannot easily confiscate: legitimacy. Many ordinary people regard her as the rightful queen. She has been visible beside Henry since the beginning of his reign. She is respected for her piety, dignity, charity, and devotion to her daughter Mary. Removing her does not feel to everyone like replacing an unsuccessful political arrangement. It feels like abandoning a wife. Eventually Henry separates Catherine from court. She is moved between residences and denied regular contact with Mary. This is particularly painful. Mother and daughter are kept apart for years, partly because neither will accept the new political reality Henry is trying to impose. Mary refuses to accept that her parents' marriage was invalid. Catherine refuses to stop calling herself queen. Henry's government therefore has the unusual problem of two women responding to royal commands with what amounts to a very respectful no. Catherine's official status is reduced to Dowager Princess of Wales, reflecting her earlier marriage to Arthur. She rejects the title. Letters come addressed to the Dowager Princess. She continues signing herself Catherine the Queen. You have to admire the administrative stamina. Servants are instructed to address her according to the king's wishes. Catherine insists on the title she believes God and law have given her. Her household is reduced. Her circumstances become increasingly restricted. Yet she does not surrender the central point. She is Henry's wife. Anne Boleyn may occupy the Queen's apartments. Anne may be crowned. Anne may give birth to a daughter recognised under Henry's new settlement. Catherine still considers herself Queen of England. This is not merely stubbornness. Her religious conscience is involved. Accepting the annulment would mean admitting that her marriage was unlawful and that Mary was not born within a valid union. Catherine would have to deny both her own honour and her daughter's rights. She will not do it. Even as her health declines, she holds the same position. Catherine dies at Kimbolton Castle in January of 1536. Shortly before her death, she is traditionally said to have written affectionately to Henry, expressing concern for his soul and referring to him with continuing devotion. The precise surviving version of that final letter has been debated, but her position at the end is perfectly clear. She never accepted that she had ceased to be his wife. Henry could remove her from court. He could remove her title. He could prevent her from seeing Mary. He could change English law and reject papal authority. But there was one final thing he could not make Catherine of Aragon do: agree with him. 23. Anne Boleyn discovers that winning Henry is not winning security. Now Anne Boleyn becomes queen, and for a brief moment it must feel as though she has won an impossible contest. Henry has pursued her for years. He has challenged the validity of his first marriage, broken with papal authority, rearranged the legal structure of the kingdom, and endured international criticism in order to marry her. Anne has gone from courtier to the woman at the centre of one of the greatest political transformations of the Tudor reign. She is crowned in 1533 with enormous ceremony. She is pregnant. Henry expects a son. Everything appears to be moving toward the future he has spent years demanding. Then Elizabeth is born. A healthy daughter is not a disaster, but it is not the prince everyone had confidently expected. Anne's position is still strong. She is queen. Henry is still attached to her, and both of them have every reason to believe that more children will follow. So the court waits. And this is where Anne begins discovering the uncomfortable difference between being desired by Henry and being secure with Henry. Desire got her to the throne. A son is supposed to keep her there. Anne is not a passive queen. She has strong opinions, a sharp intelligence, religious interests, political allies, and a temperament capable of warmth and generosity as well as impatience and confrontation. She supports reform-minded clergy and scholars. She participates in patronage. She understands that queenship offers influence and uses it. Unfortunately, influence also creates enemies. The woman who has displaced Catherine of Aragon is never going to enter the queenship with universal affection waiting for her. Catherine remains popular with many people. Mary has supporters. Conservative factions at court dislike Anne's religious sympathies. Others resent the Boleyn family's rise. Then there is Henry himself. The long pursuit has ended. Henry no longer needs to win Anne. Now he needs Anne to produce what the entire struggle was supposed to provide. The pressure changes the relationship. Anne becomes pregnant again, but no surviving son arrives. Details of all her pregnancies remain uncertain because contemporary records are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, but what matters politically is painfully clear. Elizabeth remains her only surviving child. By 1536, Anne is increasingly vulnerable. Henry's attention has begun moving toward Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own attendants. This must feel particularly cruel because Anne understands this process better than almost anyone alive. She once stood where Jane now stands. She knows what it looks like when Henry sends a woman gifts. She knows what it means when a family begins placing its daughter carefully within the king's attention. She knows how quickly an attraction can become a political project. Then, in January of 1536, Anne miscarries a male fetus. The son she desperately needs is lost. And after that, events move with frightening speed. Within months, Anne is accused of adultery with several men, including members of Henry's court. She is also accused of incest with her brother George Boleyn, and of imagining the king's death, allegations that together amount to treason. Modern historians have long questioned the credibility of these charges, and the evidence against Anne was deeply problematic. Some alleged encounters appear impossible when compared with known dates and locations. The accusations emerged inside an intensely political environment and were gathered under the direction of Thomas Cromwell, a man who had once worked closely with Anne but whose relationship with her had deteriorated. None of this saves her. Anne is arrested in May and taken to the Tower of London. Imagine the reversal. Only 3 years earlier, she had travelled through London in triumph before her coronation. Now she enters the Tower as a prisoner. The same monarchy that elevated her is dismantling her. Her marriage to Henry is annulled shortly before her execution, meaning that in a final piece of Tudor legal absurdity, Anne is effectively declared never to have been Henry's lawful wife while simultaneously being executed for committing adultery against him. Try following that logic before bed. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn is executed by sword within the Tower. Henry has arranged for an experienced swordsman from Calais, a method considered faster and more merciful than the traditional axe. It is a strangely careful gesture at the end of an extraordinarily brutal process. And Anne's story leaves you with the most important lesson about marrying Henry. Getting him to choose you is not the difficult part. The difficult part is surviving what happens after he changes his mind. 24. Jane Seymour gives Henry exactly what he wanted. Jane Seymour enters the story quietly, which is probably the safest possible way to enter Henry VIII's romantic life. She is not arriving with Anne Boleyn's sharp public presence or Catherine of Aragon's royal pedigree. Jane comes from a respectable English gentry family with useful court connections, and she serves first in Catherine's household and later in Anne's. She is already close enough to observe what happens when a queen loses Henry's affection, which must provide a fairly comprehensive education in what not to do. By early 1536, Henry is noticing her. Jane's image at court is carefully different from Anne's. Where Anne had been associated with sophistication, argument, religious reform, and a strong personality, Jane is presented as modest, obedient, restrained, and traditional. Whether this reflects Jane's entire private character is impossible to know. Court identities are often partly performances, but the contrast is useful. Henry is tired of conflict. Jane looks peaceful. Anne is still queen when Henry begins showing Jane attention. This creates an atmosphere that cannot possibly be comfortable. Gifts are offered. Jane reportedly refuses money from Henry and protects her reputation, behaving in a way that suggests she understands the danger of becoming publicly identified as the king's mistress. Her relatives help manage access to her. Everybody has seen this story before. The only difference is that Anne is now playing Catherine's part. Then events accelerate. Anne is arrested in May of 1536. She is executed on the 19th. Henry becomes formally betrothed to Jane the following day. They marry on the 30th of May. That is 11 days between one wife's execution and the next wedding. Even by Tudor standards, the emotional filing system is operating efficiently. Jane becomes queen, though she is never crowned. Plans for a coronation are discussed, but various circumstances delay it, and eventually the expected pregnancy becomes the greater priority. That pregnancy is everything. By 1537, Jane is carrying Henry's child. The court has been through this before. Hope has risen repeatedly and collapsed repeatedly. This time everyone waits with the particular intensity of people who have learned not to order the celebratory banners too early. Jane enters confinement at Hampton Court. Labour is difficult and prolonged. Then, on the 12th of October, 1537, the baby arrives. A boy, Edward. Henry finally has his legitimate male heir. The reaction is enormous. Te Deums are sung. Bells ring. Celebrations spread through the court and beyond it. Edward is christened with magnificent ceremony. The succession problem that has shaped Henry's marriages for decades appears, at last, to have been solved. Jane has done exactly what queenship demanded of her. She has produced a son, and because history has apparently decided the scene is not emotionally complicated enough, she barely has time to enjoy the achievement. After the birth, Jane becomes seriously ill. For several days there is hope that she might recover. Accounts of her condition suggest a decline following childbirth, although historians cannot diagnose the precise cause with certainty from surviving records. Infection and other postpartum complications remain possibilities. The important fact is simpler. Jane dies on the 24th of October. She is probably around 28 years old. Edward is 12 days old. Henry's long-awaited triumph and Jane's death arrive almost on top of one another. This appears to affect him deeply. Henry withdraws for a period of mourning. Jane receives an elaborate royal funeral. Unlike Henry's other wives, she will eventually be buried beside him at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Later in life, Henry will remember Jane with particular affection. Part of that affection may come from grief. Part may come from the simple fact that Jane died before the relationship had time to deteriorate. And part certainly comes from Edward. Jane gave Henry the one thing he had spent years trying to obtain, a legitimate son. This is why her position in Henry's memory becomes unique. Catherine had been the long marriage. Anne had been the great pursuit. Jane became the successful queen, which is a brutal phrase when you think about it. She fulfilled the central expectation placed upon her, survived the birth itself, and then died before she could enjoy the security everyone had promised a son would bring. Henry has his heir. England celebrates. The nursery fills with attendants. And somewhere nearby, the Queen's apartments have gone quiet. 25. Anne of Cleves meets Henry before she knows it, is Henry. Now we arrive at one of the strangest courtship episodes in the entire sequence. It is January of 1540, and Anne of Cleves has travelled from Germany to England to meet the man she is about to marry. The arrangement has been negotiated for months. Her portrait has been painted. Diplomats have inspected the political advantages. Thomas Cromwell has worked hard to secure the alliance. Anne has crossed borders, endured winter travel, entered a foreign kingdom, and prepared herself to become Queen of England. All she really has left to do is meet Henry. Henry decides this should be romantic. This is where things begin to deteriorate. Instead of waiting for a formal introduction, Henry chooses to surprise Anne at Rochester. He arrives in disguise. or at least dressed informally enough that she does not immediately recognise him as the king. This follows an old courtly tradition in which a disguised noble lover approaches his lady, and she somehow recognises him through the mysterious power of true affection. A charming idea. There is one small practical problem. Anne has never seen Henry before. She has no reason to identify the unfamiliar older gentleman suddenly entering her chamber as the King of England. She has seen portraits perhaps, but painted likenesses are not passport photographs, and Henry is now 48 years old, considerably heavier than the athletic prince of his youth, with chronic problems affecting his mobility. So Henry approaches. Anne responds politely, but she does not react with the delighted recognition he apparently expects. Depending on later accounts, Henry embraces or kisses her and presents a gift. Anne remains courteous but understandably confused. Henry leaves offended. Imagine the first date. You have travelled hundreds of miles to meet the man your government has selected as your future husband. An unfamiliar gentleman enters unexpectedly, behaves with startling familiarity, and then becomes upset because you failed an identity test nobody told you was taking place. You have been in England for approximately 5 minutes. Excellent. Henry later complains bitterly about Anne's appearance. He tells Cromwell that she is not as attractive as he expected, and reportedly uses the unflattering phrase that she resembles a Flanders mare, although that famous expression appears in later sources and should not be treated as a secure contemporary quotation. What is clear is that Henry dislikes the match almost immediately, and this puts everyone in an awkward position. The wedding has been negotiated as part of an important diplomatic alliance. England's relationship with Catholic powers in Europe has become uncertain, and Cleves offers useful Protestant connections. Cancelling everything because Henry does not feel sufficiently enchanted is therefore slightly more complicated than deleting a reservation. Cromwell is especially worried. He helped arrange this. Henry asks whether there is any legal way out. Lawyers examine Anne's earlier betrothal to Francis of Lorraine, trying to determine whether it creates an impediment. Unfortunately for Henry, the evidence is not strong enough to stop the marriage safely. So on the 6th of January, 1540, Henry marries Anne at Greenwich. There is something almost painfully awkward about it. Anne has done nothing wrong. She has followed the instructions given to her, travelled to England, behaved respectfully, and entered a marriage that powerful men on both sides assured her was desirable. Henry simply does not want her. The marriage remains unconsummated, according to Henry's later statements. He discusses his lack of attraction with members of his council in remarkably intimate detail, apparently determined to provide enough information to explain why the royal marriage bed has failed to produce anything useful. Anne, meanwhile, is living inside a palace where everyone can see that her husband is not enthusiastic. She is queen. She has attendants. She receives honours. She appears beside Henry. And the entire court understands that something is wrong. This may be one of the loneliest positions any of Henry's wives occupy. Anne is in a foreign country, speaking English imperfectly, surrounded by people she barely knows, married to a king who regretted the arrangement before the wedding even took place. Yet she does something remarkably sensible. She does not turn Henry's disappointment into a battle. When the opportunity comes to end the marriage, Anne listens. After watching what happened to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, she apparently understands that being right is not always the same thing as being safe, and very soon she will demonstrate perhaps the most useful skill any woman married to Henry can possess: knowing when to let him leave. 26. The safest marriage is the one Henry decides never existed. End. It's 1540, and Henry wants out. The problem is that he has only just married Anne of Cleves. She has crossed Europe, arrived in England, been publicly received as his bride, and taken her place as queen. The diplomatic negotiations are complete. The wedding has happened. Everyone has changed the stationery. Unfortunately, Henry has now decided that the entire arrangement was a terrible mistake, and when the King of England reaches that conclusion, other people are expected to begin finding legal reasons why he has always been correct. So the search for an exit begins. Henry claims that the marriage has never been consummated. This matters because an unconsummated marriage can be much easier to challenge than one that has produced years of shared domestic life and several children. There is also Anne's earlier betrothal to Francis of Lorraine. Was it legally binding? Was it merely an arrangement? Had it been properly dissolved? Suddenly, men with legal training become extremely interested in something arranged when Anne was a child. This is generally a sign that your marriage is going very well. The situation is especially delicate because nobody wants another Catherine of Aragon. Henry has already spent most of the previous decade fighting one queen who refused to accept an annulment. That dispute helped tear England away from papal authority, destabilised the succession, separated Henry from his daughter Mary, and consumed years of political energy. Nobody is eager for the sequel. Anne, fortunately for Henry, makes a different choice. When she is informed that the marriage is being questioned, she does not launch a public campaign to preserve it. She does not insist on remaining queen. She does not force Henry into another prolonged legal confrontation. She cooperates. This may be the single most effective decision made by any of Henry's wives. Anne agrees that the marriage can be annulled. In July of 1540, it is formally declared invalid on grounds including non-consummation and the uncertainty surrounding her previous contract. And then something remarkable happens. Henry rewards her, generously. Anne receives property, income, houses, and an honoured position within the royal family. She is granted residences including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the former Boleyn family home, which gives the entire episode a certain architectural sense of humour. More importantly, she is styled the king's beloved sister. That sounds like an extraordinary demotion until you remember the available alternatives. Being Henry's sister is considerably safer than being Henry's wife. Anne remains in England rather than returning to Cleves. She has money, servants, estates, and a level of independence that most Tudor women could only dream about. She attends court on important occasions. She maintains cordial relations with Henry. She also develops good relationships with his children, particularly Mary and Elizabeth. At Christmas celebrations after the annulment, Anne can appear socially with the royal family. She is no longer expected to produce an heir. She no longer has to share Henry's bed. She no longer has to worry whether his attention is wandering toward one of her attendants. And Henry seems to like her considerably more once they are not married. This may be the healthiest relationship he has with any of his wives. There are occasional rumours that Henry might remarry Anne after the fall of Catherine Howard, but nothing comes of them. Anne remains unmarried for the rest of her life. And why would you rush? You have already experienced the Tudor marriage market at its highest possible level. It was enough. Anne outlives Henry. She outlives Edward VI. She survives into the reign of Mary I and dies in 1557, the last of Henry's 6 wives to die. Think about that for a moment. Catherine fought to remain Henry's wife and died separated from her daughter. Anne Boleyn fought for her position and lost her head. Jane Seymour gave Henry his son and died after childbirth. Anne of Cleves receives an annulment, several houses, a comfortable income, and nearly another 17 years of life. The lesson is brutally practical. When Henry tells you that your marriage never really existed, you may feel insulted. You may feel humiliated. You may even feel tempted to argue. Do not. Take the property, take the title, take the palace, and get out while the paperwork is still friendly. 27. Catherine Howard learns that being adored is not protection. Henry's 5th queen is young. Exactly how young is uncertain because Catherine Howard's birth date was never conveniently recorded for historians, but she was probably still in her late teens or early 20s when Henry married her in 1540. Henry is 49. He is increasingly heavy, troubled by his injured legs, and no longer remotely resembles the athletic Golden Prince. Catherine of Aragon married 3 decades earlier. Catherine, by contrast, is lively, attractive, sociable, and energetic. To Henry, she appears to offer youth itself, walking cheerfully into the palace. He is delighted, and this is precisely why you should not relax. Catherine comes from the enormous Howard family, one of the most powerful noble families in England. She is also a cousin of Anne Boleyn, which might have encouraged everyone involved to consider a completely different career path. But Tudor families are admirably resistant to hints. As a girl, Catherine spends much of her upbringing in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. It is a large, loosely supervised establishment filled with young people. Catherine receives less rigorous oversight than a future queen would ideally require, although nobody knows she is a future queen yet. During these years, she becomes involved with her music teacher, Henry Minox, and later with Francis Derham, one of the Duchess's secretaries. The precise nature of these relationships is difficult to reconstruct because most surviving evidence comes from investigations conducted when Catherine's life depends upon the answers. What matters is that Catherine has a sexual history before Henry. That history does not disappear simply because she acquires a crown. Catherine later joins Anne of Cleves' household as a maid of honour. Henry notices her while his fourth marriage is already collapsing. Once again, one queen's household has conveniently supplied the next candidate. Henry marries Catherine in July of 1540. He showers her with gifts. For a time, he seems rejuvenated by the marriage. Catherine participates in court entertainment, wears beautiful clothes, dances, receives jewels, and occupies the dazzling position of a young queen beside a husband who appears completely enchanted with her. If you are Catherine, this must feel secure. Henry chose you. Henry adores you. Henry has already dismissed Anne of Cleves. Surely being loved by him is the safest place you can possibly stand. Unfortunately, you have watched enough of this story to know better. The real danger emerges when information about Catherine's past reaches Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in 1541. John Lascelles, whose sister Mary Hall had known Catherine in the Dowager Duchess's household, brings allegations concerning Catherine's earlier behaviour. An investigation begins. People are questioned. Old relationships are reconstructed. Francis Derham is examined. Then another name appears, Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper is a gentleman of Henry's privy chamber, and therefore physically close to the king. Evidence emerges that Catherine has been meeting him secretly during the royal progress of 1541, assisted by Lady Rochford. Whether Catherine and Culpeper actually committed adultery cannot be established with complete certainty from the surviving evidence. Their secret meetings were dangerous enough, because you are not simply an unhappy young wife meeting another man. You are the queen. Adultery involving the king's wife raises questions of succession, legitimacy, and treason. Henry is devastated when the accusations reach him. At first, he reportedly struggles to believe them. That matters. This is not merely a husband who has become bored and found a convenient replacement. Henry appears to have been genuinely attached to Catherine. Her apparent betrayal strikes directly at his pride, masculinity, and authority. And royal heartbreak is extremely dangerous heartbreak. Catherine is removed from court and confined. Her former admirers disappear. The jewels stop arriving. The palace that celebrated her marriage now produces interrogators. Parliament eventually passes legislation making it treason for a queen to conceal certain aspects of her sexual history before marrying the king, while Catherine herself is condemned through attainder rather than an ordinary public trial. On the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard is executed at the Tower of London. She may be only around 20 years old. Henry had adored her. That is the point. His affection had brought her jewels, rank, influence, and a crown. It could not protect her once affection became humiliation. So if Henry looks across the room at you with absolute devotion, enjoy the moment. Just remember what you have learned by now. Sunshine at the Tudor court is lovely. It is not armour. 28. The palace can turn gossip into a criminal investigation. Let's talk about rumour, because Tudor court gossip is not merely unpleasant. It can become evidence. A whispered conversation in a gallery, a servant noticing who entered a room, a letter passed between two people who should perhaps have been more careful. All of it can move surprisingly quickly from private embarrassment to official inquiry. At Henry's court, information is currency, and when the subject involves the Queen, the King's honour, or the legitimacy of future children, nobody treats that currency casually. This becomes painfully clear during Catherine Howard's downfall. Once allegations about her earlier relationships reach Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in 1541, the matter cannot simply remain gossip. Cranmer knows the danger of approaching Henry with accusations against a wife he appears to adore, so the information is reportedly placed before the king carefully. Henry initially seems reluctant to believe it. Then the investigation begins. And this is the moment when the palace changes character around you. The same corridors where you danced, laughed, and received gifts become routes for messengers carrying testimony. The same servants who helped arrange your clothing may now be questioned about your movements. People who once stood quietly in the background become suddenly important because they happen to see who entered a chamber after supper. Investigators start reconstructing your life. Who knew you before marriage? Who shared a household with you? What conversations took place? Were promises exchanged? Was there a sexual relationship? Did anyone help conceal it? The Tudor state has no modern forensic science, but it has something almost as exhausting. People who remember things. Catherine's earlier life in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk is examined in detail. Former companions are questioned about Henry Manox and Francis Derham. Derham himself becomes a central figure because of his previous relationship with Catherine. Then attention turns toward Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper has access to Henry through the Privy Chamber and appears to have met Catherine secretly during the royal progress. Lady Rochford helps arrange some of those meetings. That alone is disastrous. Even if you leave aside the uncertain question of whether Catherine and Culpeper actually committed adultery, secret nighttime meetings between the Queen and another man are not the sort of detail Tudor investigators describe as encouraging. Now, every small action becomes suspicious. Why was the door closed? Why was Lady Rochford standing nearby? Why did Culpeper remain so long? Why were messages exchanged? The court begins doing what courts do best. It joins dots. Some of the dots are real. Some may be interpreted under enormous pressure. Confessions and testimony in Tudor investigations have to be handled carefully by modern historians because the people answering questions are not sitting in a relaxed interview with tea and legal representation. Their own safety may depend on providing useful information. But from your position inside the palace, academic caution arrives several centuries too late. You only see doors closing, people disappearing, former friends becoming witnesses. Derham and Culpeper are eventually executed in December of 1541. Catherine's own position continues deteriorating. She is stripped of her queenship and confined while Parliament moves against her. Rather than receiving the kind of public trial Anne Boleyn had faced, Catherine is condemned through a bill of attainder. Parliament can therefore turn the allegations into punishment without requiring an ordinary criminal trial before a jury. It is bureaucracy at its most terrifyingly efficient. Even the people around Catherine are endangered. Lady Rochford, who assisted the meetings with Culpeper, is also condemned and ultimately executed. This is why the Queen's household can never be regarded as merely domestic. Your attendants are witnesses to royal life. They know who comes and goes. They carry letters. They hear arguments. They see tears. They notice whether the king has visited. And if the government becomes interested, their memories may suddenly be summoned into rooms full of serious men asking very specific questions. The palace therefore has two completely different personalities. On a good day, it is music, velvet, gardens, food, gossip, flirting, and elaborate clothing. On a bad day, the same gossip acquires clerks. That is when you should worry. Because once Tudor rumours start being written down, somebody is usually having a very difficult week. 29. By the sixth marriage, everyone understands the risk. Now Henry wants to marry Catherine Parr. And by this point, nobody at court needs a briefing on what becoming Henry VIII's wife might involve. The position has been tested 5 times already. 1 marriage ended after years of legal warfare. 1 ended at the scaffold. 1 ended with childbirth and death. 1 was annulled with property attached. 1 ended at the scaffold again. The vacancy is therefore prestigious, wealthy, politically important, and carrying the sort of employment history that would make a sensible applicant suddenly remember another appointment. Catherine Parr is sensible. This is what makes her interesting. She is not a sheltered teenager entering court life for the first time. She has already been married twice and widowed twice. Her second husband, John Neville, Lord Latimer, had died in 1543. By then, Catherine is experienced in running a household, managing property, navigating difficult family circumstances, and surviving the political instability of Tudor England without becoming the central topic of a treason investigation. That is already an impressive qualification. She is also educated, religiously serious, and intellectually curious. She reads widely, develops strong interests in theology, and will eventually become the first English queen to publish works under her own name. Unfortunately, she has another plan. Catherine appears to have formed an attachment to Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour and therefore uncle to Prince Edward. Under ordinary circumstances, Thomas might have become her third husband. Then Henry becomes interested. This presents Catherine with one of the least romantic calculations in English history. On one side you have Thomas Seymour, younger, attractive, ambitious, and apparently the man you actually want. On the other side you have the King of England, and the king has asked first. Catherine later writes that she had been inclined towards Seymour but believed she was called by God to marry Henry instead. Her language is deeply religious, and there is no reason to dismiss that conviction. But the political reality is impossible to ignore. Refusing Henry is difficult. Refusing Henry after he has buried, annulled, or executed 5 previous wives is the kind of decision you would want to make extremely carefully. So Catherine accepts. She marries Henry at Hampton Court in July of 1543. The ceremony is relatively private, attended by a small group in the Queen's closet. There is no enormous public coronation afterward. Henry has already staged enough royal weddings to understand the basic procedure. Catherine enters the marriage with something the younger wives did not possess: information. She knows Henry's habits. She knows his temper. She knows how court factions operate. She knows that royal affection can vanish. She knows that arguments over religion are dangerous. She knows that producing a son is no longer urgently required because Edward already exists. Most importantly, she knows that surviving Henry may depend less on romance than on judgment, and Henry needs something different from her now. He is no longer the athletic young king Catherine of Aragon married. He is in his early 50s, suffering from chronic problems with his legs, increasingly limited in mobility, and frequently in pain. Catherine becomes companion as much as bride. She helps create a stable royal household. She builds warm relationships with Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, helping bring them together around the court. She encourages education, especially Elizabeth's formidable intellectual development. Henry trusts her enough to appoint her regent when he campaigns in France in 1544. That is significant. For several months, Catherine helps oversee the kingdom in his absence, working with counsellors and handling responsibilities that demonstrate Henry's confidence in her competence. You are no longer simply smiling beside him at dinner. You are helping run England. But competence does not remove danger. If anything, Catherine's intelligence creates new problems later, particularly when religious debate at court becomes increasingly bitter. Conservative counsellors begin watching her Protestant sympathies carefully, and by now everyone understands exactly what can happen when one of Henry's wives becomes politically inconvenient. So when people congratulate you on becoming the 6th Queen of England, you smile, you thank them, you accept the jewels, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you quietly remember that the previous 5 women have already provided the most comprehensive marriage advice imaginable. 30. Being intelligent around Henry requires careful packaging. Catherine Parr is educated, and under almost any other circumstances this would be uncomplicatedly useful. She reads widely, writes, discusses theology, supports learning, and takes a serious interest in the religious arguments reshaping England. She is not merely capable of following an intellectual conversation, she enjoys one. Unfortunately, she is married to Henry VIII, which means even a discussion about scripture can become unexpectedly close to a criminal investigation if the wrong people decide you have been enjoying it too confidently. By the 1540s, religion at Henry's court is dangerous territory. England has broken with Rome, but that does not mean Henry has calmly transformed himself into a straightforward Protestant reformer. His religious position remains distinctly Henry-shaped. He rejects papal authority and supports certain reforms, but he also retains many traditional Catholic doctrines and practices. Around him, competing factions push in different directions. Reformers want further change. Conservatives want to restrain it. And you, as Queen, have reforming sympathies. Catherine surrounds herself with educated people and supports evangelical writers and preachers. She takes particular interest in scripture in English. In 1545 she publishes prayers or meditations, and later the Lamentation of a Sinner, making her one of the first English queens to publish works under her own name. This is remarkable. It is also the sort of thing your husband's conservative advisers notice. At first, Henry appears to enjoy discussing religion with Catherine. He is intelligent and theologically engaged himself. He has been arguing religious questions for decades, and is perfectly capable of spending an evening debating doctrine instead of doing something relaxing. So you talk. You discuss scripture. You ask questions. Perhaps you disagree. This is where the packaging becomes important. Henry likes intellectual conversation. Henry does not especially enjoy discovering that someone thinks he is wrong. There is a subtle but important difference. As his health worsens, Catherine sometimes sits with him during long periods when pain restricts his movement. Their religious conversations can provide companionship and distraction. She may argue points with genuine confidence. Then conservative enemies at court see an opening. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley are among those associated with efforts against reform-minded figures. Catherine's religious circle attracts suspicion, particularly amid wider investigations into Protestant beliefs. The danger becomes very real. According to later accounts, Henry complains that Catherine has become too argumentative in theological discussion. Conservatives encourage his irritation and begin building a case. A warrant is prepared for her arrest. This is one of those moments when being married to Henry must become physically cold. You have seen what an arrest warrant can become. Anne Boleyn received one. Catherine Howard received one. Nobody needs to explain the possible next steps. Fortunately, Catherine reportedly learns what is happening before the warrant is carried out, and she responds with extraordinary political intelligence. She goes to Henry, but she does not march into his room and insist that she is correct. That would be intellectually satisfying for perhaps 12 seconds. Instead, she reframes everything. According to the traditional account, Catherine tells Henry that she has never intended to instruct him in religious matters. How could she, a woman, presume to teach a king whom God has appointed as her head and governor? She explains that when she debated with him, she did so because she wanted to learn from his greater wisdom, and, conveniently, because conversation distracted him from the pain in his leg. It is an exceptional piece of marital diplomacy. You are not saying, "I withdraw my argument." You are saying, "I was merely giving you an opportunity to explain why you are brilliant." Henry accepts this. When officials later arrive to arrest Catherine, Henry reportedly drives them away angrily. The danger passes. Whether every detail of this famous scene occurred exactly as later writers described is difficult to establish, but Catherine's broader political skill is unmistakable. She survives a court where theological disagreement could become fatal because she understands when intelligence must be presented as humility. This is the peculiar trap. Henry values clever people. He values educated women. He trusts Catherine enough to leave her as regent while he campaigns in France. But intelligence remains safest when it does not appear to challenge his authority. So you learn the method. Read widely. Think deeply. Write carefully. Discuss theology. And if your husband begins narrowing his eyes during the conversation, gently remind him that you are only asking questions because listening to him is so tremendously educational. You can keep your argument. You simply let Henry think he won it. 31. The older Henry is a completely different husband. Now, look at the man beside you. If you first knew Henry as the Golden Prince of 1509, the change is difficult to ignore. The young king had been tall, athletic, energetic, and almost aggressively fond of displaying it. He hunted for hours, danced late into the evening, played tennis, wrestled, rode hard, and entered jousting tournaments with the enthusiasm of a man who believed being king should involve considerably more galloping. By the 1540s, much of that life has disappeared. Henry is now in his 50s, severely overweight, increasingly restricted in his movement, and living with chronic pain from badly damaged legs. Being married to him now is a very different experience. The transformation did not happen overnight. Henry suffered various injuries during years of riding and tournament sport, but the accident everyone remembers occurred in January of 1536. During a joust at Greenwich, Henry fell from his horse and the heavily armoured animal fell on top of him. Reports suggest that he was unconscious for a period, causing panic at court. He survived, but his physical problems became increasingly serious during the years that followed. It is tempting to claim that this single accident transformed Henry's personality completely, and you will often hear the story told that way. The evidence is not nearly that tidy. Historians cannot confidently diagnose a brain injury centuries later, and Henry had demonstrated ruthlessness, vanity, and an enormous sense of royal authority long before 1536. What is clear is that his health deteriorated. Chronic ulcers developed on his legs, sometimes becoming badly inflamed and extremely painful. Movement became more difficult. Exercise decreased. His weight increased significantly. For a man whose identity had been built around physical strength, this must have been particularly frustrating. Imagine being someone who once entered the lists in armour before cheering crowds and now requires increasing assistance simply to move comfortably around your own palace. Unfortunately, you are married to the person experiencing that frustration. Henry's clothing and equipment adapt to his changing body. Surviving armour shows just how dramatically his size increased. Horses, saddles, chairs, and other practical arrangements must accommodate a king who is no longer capable of moving through court with his old ease. He can still travel. He can still hunt in modified ways. He can still conduct government, enjoy music, discuss theology, receive ambassadors, eat magnificently, and take an active interest in political affairs. But everything takes more effort. Pain follows him. And chronic pain is not famous for improving anybody's mood. As Catherine Parr, you experience this version of Henry at extremely close range. You may spend long periods with him when his legs are troubling him. You read with him. You discuss religion. You provide companionship during periods when the more vigorous pleasures of his youth are increasingly unavailable. This gives the sixth marriage a very different rhythm from the first. Catherine of Aragon married a teenager who could spend the morning hunting and the evening dancing. You have married a man who may need help getting through the room. There is something genuinely sad about that change, but there is also danger. Henry is now more experienced in wielding power and less accustomed than ever to meaningful resistance. He has seen ministers fall, noble families destroyed, religious opponents executed, monasteries dissolved, rebellions suppressed, and 2 queens sent to the scaffold. The people around him know what displeasure can mean, so they become careful. Very careful. A servant approaching his injured leg needs care. A counsellor bringing bad news needs care. A wife debating theology definitely needs care. And the atmosphere around the aging king can therefore become strangely tense. Everyone is watching his mood because his mood has consequences. Yet Henry is not simply raging through his final years. That would be easier to understand. He can still show affection. He values Catherine Parr enough to entrust her with the regency. When he campaigns in France in 1544, he remains interested in scholarship, religion, music, architecture, and the education of his children. The difficult qualities coexist with the intelligent and engaging ones. That is what makes living beside him complicated. You can see the man he once was. Sometimes, perhaps, you still hear him. Then he tries to stand. The pain returns. Someone moves forward to help. And suddenly the handsome young king from the tournament field feels very far away. You are still married to Henry VIII, but you are no longer married to the prince England once knew, and everyone in the room has learned to notice the difference. 32. Surviving Henry is not the same thing as escaping him. And finally, the extraordinary marriage ends the only way one of Henry's marriages safely can. Henry dies first. On the 28th of January, 1547, after nearly 38 years on the throne, and 6 marriages that have altered English religion, succession, diplomacy, and the blood pressure of everyone unfortunate enough to marry into the royal household, Henry VIII dies at Whitehall Palace. Catherine Parr is still alive. That fact alone makes her unusual. She has survived the theological arguments, the conservative faction at court, the arrest warrant that nearly reached her, Henry's worsening health, his temper, and the constant awareness that 2 previous queens had entered the Tower and never returned. Now, suddenly, the danger at the centre of her life is gone. Henry's 9-year-old son Edward becomes king. Catherine is a queen dowager. She is wealthy, respected, still relatively young, and no longer married to the most unpredictable husband in England. For the first time in years, she can make choices without wondering whether one badly phrased disagreement might eventually involve the Lord Chancellor, and almost immediately she makes one. She marries Thomas Seymour. This is the man she appears to have wanted before Henry intervened. Seymour is handsome, ambitious, charming, politically connected, and the younger brother of Jane Seymour, making him uncle to the new king. Catherine finally gets the husband she had once been inclined toward, which sounds like the beginning of the peaceful ending she has earned. It is not. The marriage is conducted secretly only a few months after Henry's death, partly because marrying so quickly risks scandal. Catherine has been the king's widow for barely enough time to finish the official mourning before she is privately becoming somebody else's wife. People notice. Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, is particularly displeased. Elizabeth, however, is living in Catherine's household. This becomes important. Catherine has taken the young Elizabeth under her care and supports her education. Elizabeth is 14, highly intelligent, observant, and already developing the extraordinary self-control that will later become one of her defining political skills. Thomas Seymour begins behaving toward her in ways that make the household uncomfortable. He enters Elizabeth's chamber early in the morning. He engages in horseplay. He reportedly slaps or pats her familiarly. On at least one occasion, Catherine herself participates in playful behaviour before the situation becomes increasingly inappropriate. Eventually, Catherine sends Elizabeth away from the household. For a woman who has spent years navigating Henry's dangerous court, it is a sad reminder that survival does not automatically produce peace. Then something happens Catherine has never experienced before. She becomes pregnant. She is probably around 35 years old. After 4 marriages, including more than 3 years as Henry's wife, this is her first known pregnancy. There must be hope in that, perhaps anxiety too. Catherine has watched women give birth. She knows exactly how dangerous it can be. She lived beside Henry when Jane Seymour died after producing Edward. She has seen royal childbirth surrounded by prayers, physicians, attendants, and absolutely no guarantee that any of them can save the mother if something goes badly wrong. Still, the pregnancy proceeds. In August of 1548, Catherine gives birth at Sudeley Castle to a daughter named Mary Seymour. The baby survives the delivery. Catherine does too, for the moment. Then, within days, Catherine becomes seriously ill. The surviving descriptions strongly suggest puerperal fever, the postpartum infection that killed so many women before anyone understood bacteria, antisepsis, or the extraordinary medical value of washing hands properly. She develops fever. Her condition worsens. And on the 5th of September, 1548, Catherine Parr dies. She has survived Henry by less than 2 years. There is something painfully ironic about it. History remembers her through the convenient rhyme as survived. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. As though Catherine reaches the end credits, closes the palace door behind her, and enjoys 40 peaceful years gardening somewhere. She does not. She escapes Henry's marriage, only to enter another complicated household, experience her first pregnancy, and die following childbirth. Her daughter Mary disappears from the surviving historical record while still very young and probably died in childhood. Thomas Seymour lasts only months longer. His reckless political ambitions lead to his arrest for treason, and he is executed in 1549, so even the surviving wife receives no tidy ending, and perhaps that is the final lesson of marrying Henry. The rhyme makes 6 lives sound simple. They were anything but. Catherine of Aragon resisted. Anne Boleyn rose and fell. Jane Seymour gave Henry his son. Anne of Cleves recognised the value of leaving. Catherine Howard was destroyed by a court that remembered everything. Catherine Parr survived the king, but surviving Henry was never the same thing as escaping the century that made him possible.